Have you ever wondered if the history you were taught was really the whole story? What if some of the most pivotal moments in our past, the Great Wars, the rise and fall of civilizations, were not just the work of famous heroes or infamous villains, but something else entirely, moving silently behind the scenes? Today, we're beginning an epic journey into one of the most captivating mysteries of ancient myth, the hidden influence of a forgotten power known as the Umbrals, and their secret manipulation of the mighty Maiar. This is a tale of courage, discovery, and the relentless pursuit of truth, one that begins with a single scroll, a curious scholar, and a secret that could rewrite everything we thought we knew. Before we dive in, we'd love to know where you're joining us from today. Are you tuning in from a bustling city or a quiet town? And what time is it where you are? Let us know in the comments below. It's always wonderful to feel connected with this community as we explore these timeless stories together. Our story begins in the dusty, forgotten ruins of an old library, where a young scholar named Elara spends her days sifting through fragments of the past. She isn't just looking for knowledge, she's searching for meaning, for answers to questions that have haunted her since she first learned of the great conflicts that shaped her world. And then, one day, she finds it, a hidden scroll tucked away in a crack in the stone, as if waiting just for her. As she unrolls it, her heart quickens. The writing is ancient, the symbols obscure, but the message is clear. There is a force, a shadowy presence known only as the Umbrals, that has been pulling the strings behind the Maiar, the powerful beings once thought to be the masters of their own destiny. This scroll suggests that the Great Wars were not merely clashes of will or ideology, but part of a deeper, darker game, driven by a mix of curiosity and duty. Alara realizes that this discovery is more than just academic. It's a call to action. If this scroll is true, then everything she's ever believed about history, power, and even the nature of truth itself might be built on a foundation of lies. With a determined heart, she decides to follow this mystery wherever it leads, no matter the risk. She knows that uncovering the truth could challenge the very foundations of her world, but she also knows that some truths are too important to remain hidden. And so, her quest begins a journey that will take her through ancient forests, into guarded cities, and face to face with enemies who would do anything to keep the shadows in power. This is the story of how one person's courage can illuminate the darkest corners of history, and how the search for truth can change the world forever. Leaving the safety of the library ruins behind, Alara knew there was only one person who might be able to verify the scroll's authenticity and understand its terrifying implications: the reclusive historian, Kalin. He lived on the edge of the city, in a small, cluttered cottage that seemed to lean against the world for support. Much like the man himself, Kalin was known for his brilliant mind, but also for his deep cynicism, having retreated from academic life after his own controversial theories were dismissed by the established order. Elara found him surrounded by towering stacks of books and yellowed parchment, a man who had traded the company of people for the whispers of the past. When she first presented the scroll, his reaction was exactly what she had feared. He barely glanced at it, his voice a low grumble as he called it yet another piece of romantic nonsense, a fairy tale for those who preferred exciting myths to complicated realities. He argued that the Maiar were powerful enough architects of their own destinies, The idea of some hidden hand guiding them was to him a comforting story we tell ourselves to make chaos feel like order. But Alara was prepared for his skepticism. She didn't just ask him to believe her, she showed him. She pointed to specific phrases in the text, cross-referencing them with obscure passages in his own books, matching the style of script to a period thought to be purely legendary. She laid out a trail of linguistic and historical breadcrumbs that even he could not easily dismiss. Their debate stretched through the afternoon, filled with the sound of rustling pages and rising passion. It was during this exchange that Alara saw the true source of his resistance. It wasn't a lack of curiosity, but a surplus of fear. Kalin confessed that in his younger, more idealistic days, he had stumbled upon similar fragments of this story. His pursuit of them had cost him his reputation and nearly his life, as shadowy figures had warned him away, leaving threats that felt all too real. He had buried that part of his research and himself in this isolated home, choosing the safety of silence over the peril of the truth. He was afraid not of being wrong, but of being right. Yet, it was Alara's unwavering determination that finally broke through his defenses. She spoke not of glory or academic triumph, but of responsibility. She argued that if this knowledge existed, it belonged to the world, and that keeping it hidden was a form of collaboration with those who would manipulate history for power. Her courage reignited a spark he thought had long gone cold. With a heavy sigh that seemed to carry the weight of his own past regrets, Kalin reluctantly agreed to help. It was a fragile alliance, built not on blind trust, but on a shared recognition of the danger ahead and the profound importance of their goal. Together, they would follow the path the scroll had revealed, stepping out of the shadows of doubt and into the uncertain light of a quest for hidden knowledge. Their journey led them away from the settled lands and into the whispering woods, a place where the very air seemed to hum with ancient secrets. The trees here were not like ordinary trees. Their bark was etched with intricate, spiraling patterns that were said to be the physical record of ages long past, a library written not on parchment, but on living wood. Kalin moved with a soldier's caution, his eyes constantly scanning the dense undergrowth, his hand never far from the hilt of his knife. The historian's fear was palpable, a stark contrast to the quiet awe that filled Elara. For her, this was a sacred space. She could almost feel the whispers of history rustling through the leaves above, a sensation that was both thrilling and deeply unnerving. While Kalin stood guard, his back to a massive, gnarled oak, Alara set to work. She ran her fingers gently over the grooves in the bark of a particularly ancient tree, her touch as light as a scribe turning a fragile page. She murmured to herself, comparing the symbols she saw to those on her precious scroll. Some markings were maps of forgotten constellations, while others seemed to depict great battles or pacts made between powers mortal and divine. She was so engrossed in her deciphering, piecing together a story of how the Umbrals first began their subtle influence, that she almost missed the subtle change in the forest's song. The gentle whisper of the wind shifted, carrying with it a new sound, the soft, nearly silent crush of leaves underfoot that did not belong to any forest creature. The attack came without a shout or a warning. Figures clad in dark, muted fabrics seemed to melt out from between the trees, their movements a blur of silent efficiency. They moved not like bandits, but like a coordinated unit, their target immediately clear. One made a direct lunge for the satchel at Alara's hip, where the scroll was kept. Kalin reacted instantly, shoving her behind him and meeting the assailant with a grunt of effort. The clash of his knife against a short blade, ringing out sharply in the hushed woods. The peaceful clearing erupted into a frantic struggle. Elara's mind raced, her heart pounding in her ears. These were no ordinary thieves. They fought with a purpose, and they wanted the scroll above all else. In that heart-stopping moment, a terrible clarity washed over her. The knowledge contained on that parchment was far too dangerous to let fall into their hands. Letting them capture her or Kalin was unthinkable, but losing the scroll would mean the end of their quest before it had truly begun. Her eyes darted around, searching for any solution, and landed on a large, hollowed-out section at the base of the great oak beside her. It was a desperate, reckless gamble. The hollow was exposed to the elements and any curious animal. The scroll could be lost forever, ruined by rain, or simply overlooked in the vastness of the woods. But it was the only chance they had. With a final, frantic glance at Kalin, who was holding two attackers at bay, she made her choice. In one fluid motion, she pulled the scroll from her satchel and thrust it deep into the dark cavity of the tree, silently praying to the memory of the forest itself to keep it safe. The action took only a second, but it felt like an eternity, a conscious gamble that risked their most vital clue to protect the larger mission. Breathing heavily, their backs pressed against the rough bark of the trees, just beyond the whispering woods, the reality of their situation settled upon Alara and Kalin like a heavy frost. The frantic energy of the fight was gone, replaced by a cold, creeping dread. These were not mere bandits or opportunistic thieves. The attackers had moved with a chilling synchronicity, their silence more terrifying than any battle cry, and their focus had been absolute. They wanted the scroll and were willing to kill for it. Kalin, wiping a smear of dirt from his brow, was the first to voice the terrible conclusion. They weren't just hired blades, he muttered, his voice low and grim. They moved as one. They are servants, and if they serve the power your scroll describes, then we are not just being chased. We are being hunted. The need for a safe haven became their only thought, a sanctuary where they could catch their breath, regroup, and understand the enormity of what they were facing. Kalin's mind, once again sharpened by the adrenaline of survival, turned to the city of Eldoria. Nestled in a valley to the east, it was renowned across the land as a beacon of knowledge. Its skyline dominated not by fortresses, but by the great domes of its libraries and the spires of its academic halls. It was a place where scholars and historians gathered, a city that prized learning above all else. If any place held answers about the Umbrals, or at least fragments of the truth that had been overlooked, it would be there. More importantly, the city's very identity offered a form of protection. In a place devoted to the free exchange of ideas, perhaps the shadows that pursued them would find it harder to move unnoticed. Their journey to Eldoria was a tense and anxious trek. Every rustle in the bushes, every snap of a twig in the distance, sent their hearts racing. They avoided the main roads, sticking to game trails and less traveled paths, their progress slowed by a constant, watchful paranoia. Sleep was a luxury they could scarcely afford, taking turns keeping watch through the long, dark nights, each sound of the forest amplified by their fear. The landscape itself seemed to echo their unease. They passed a small farming village where the people spoke in hushed tones about strange figures seen moving through the twilight, and on their second day, they spotted a lone rider on a distant ridge, stationary and watching, who vanished before they could decide if he was a threat or merely a shepherd. These moments were constant reminders that their enemies were not far behind, a persistent pressure that made the shining idea of Eldoria feel both like a lifeline and a destination that might be impossibly far away. Yet, with each step, their resolve only hardened. The attempt to steal the scroll had transformed their quest from an academic exercise into a vital mission. They were no longer just seeking knowledge, they were protecting it. Alara found herself replaying the moment she hid the scroll in the hollow tree, a decision made in a split second that now felt monumentally significant. Its loss was a devastating blow, but it had also stripped away any illusion of safety. They were committed now, bound together by shared danger and a shared purpose. As the first glimpse of Eldoria's white walls finally appeared on the horizon, glowing in the late afternoon sun, they felt a surge of cautious hope. The city represented a chance to find allies, to piece together new clues, and to turn from prey into hunters of the truth. But they also knew the shadows would follow them there, and that within those hallowed halls of learning, a new kind of battle was about to begin. The gleaming white walls of Eldoria felt less like a promise and more like a trap, as Alara and Kalin passed through the bustling main gate. The city was a symphony of orderly chaos. Scholars in deep conversation hurried through the streets, the air thick with the scent of old paper and ink from the open doors of scriptoriums, and the general hum of 1,000 different debates happening at once. Yet, for all its celebrated openness, every shadow between the grand marble buildings now seemed to hold a potential threat. Their first priority was to find someone who could help, someone with access to the deeper, less traveled archives where forbidden knowledge might be hidden. Kalin, using old contacts from his academic days, secured them a meeting with a junior archivist named Lyra, known for her expertise in pre-Maiar iconography, and more quietly, for her willingness to ask questions others deemed too dangerous. They found her in a small, windowless chamber, deep within the great library of Eldoria, a room so filled with teetering stacks of parchment and oddly shaped artifacts that it felt more like a curated cavern than an office. Lyra was a woman of sharp angles and even sharper eyes, her fingers stained with ink as she meticulously restored a crumbling piece of vellum. She listened to their story with a practiced, skeptical silence, her expression giving nothing away until Alara, hesitantly, described the specific symbols from the lost scroll. At the mention of a particular twisting sigil that resembled a serpent consuming its own tail, Lyra's hands stilled. Her professional detachment evaporated in an instant. She leaned forward, her voice dropping to a whisper that was barely audible over the distant echoes of the library. "You have seen the Ouroboros of silence," she said. "Where did you find it?" Her reaction was not one of academic curiosity, but of grave concern. She confirmed that the symbols were real, part of a visual language used by a group so secretive that most historians considered them a fringe myth, a secret society known as the Keepers of the Vale. Lyra explained that this group did not create knowledge, they systematically suppressed it. They believed that certain truths were too dangerous for the world to know, that the stability of civilization relied on a foundation of managed ignorance. They had agents everywhere, she warned, especially in places like this: libraries, universities, centers of power. They didn't just discourage research into certain areas, they made it disappear, and they made researchers disappear along with it. Her own mentor had vanished years ago after pursuing a similar line of inquiry, a loss that had taught Lyra the price of curiosity and the necessity of extreme caution. This warning hung heavily in the dusty air, transforming their quest from a race against mysterious attackers into a battle against a deeply embedded, ideological enemy. The shadows that had ambushed them in the woods now had a name and a philosophy, making them infinitely more terrifying. Lyra looked from Alara's determined face to Kalin's grim one, weighing the risks. She saw in them not just the desperation of the pursued, but a genuine, burning need to understand. Finally, she made her offer. She would help them. She had resources they could only dream of: access to restricted collections, deciphering tools, and a network of discreet contacts. But her help came with a condition, a pact of trust that had to be mutual. They must promise her that whatever they discovered, no matter how shocking or world-altering, they would share it fully with her. She would not be used as a tool and then left in the dark. She would be a full partner in the revelation. This was not merely a transaction. It was an alliance built on the shared understanding that the truth, no matter how dangerous, belonged to everyone. Elara, without hesitation, agreed. In that small, book-filled room, a new trio was forged, bound together not just by a common goal, but by a solemn vow to drag the secrets of the shadows into the light. Lyra's fingers traced the faded symbols on the copied parchment spread across her desk, the air in the small room growing thick with anticipation. Her earlier warning about the keepers of the Vale had cast a long shadow, but now her expression was one of focused excitement. The scroll doesn't just speak of the Umbrals in abstracts, she explained, her voice a low, intent murmur. It gives a location, a place of proof. She pointed to a cluster of interconnected symbols, a stylized eye, a downward pointing arrow, and the distinctive coiled form of the Ouroboros. This is a directional cipher. It describes a hidden chamber, a sanctum, buried deep beneath the foundations of the Temple of the First Dawn. She looked up, her gaze sharp. It's the oldest standing structure in Eldoria, the perfect place to hide a secret in plain sight. The Temple of the First Dawn was not a place of active worship, but a preserved historical site. Its austere stone walls a quiet testament to a simpler, older time. Gaining entry after hours was a nerve-wracking endeavor. Lyra, using her status as an archivist, secured them access under the pretense of conducting a structural survey for the Historical Society, a thin cover story that felt paper thin under the watchful eyes of the temple guards. Once inside the main hall, with its high, vaulted ceiling echoing their every footstep, they found the entrance not in some obvious altar, but concealed behind a massive, carved stone relief depicting the Maiar bestowing gifts upon the first mortals. The key was in the depiction itself. Lyra identified that one of the gifts, a glowing orb held in a Maiar's hand, was not carved from the same stone as the rest of the wall. It was a separate mechanism, a disguised pressure plate. Pressing it required Kalin's strength, and with a deep, grinding groan that sounded far too loud in the silent temple, a section of the wall slid backward and then sideways, revealing a dark, narrow staircase that descended into the earth. The air that wafted up was ancient, cold, and carried the scent of dry dust and undisturbed time. This was no grand entrance. It was a forgotten throat into the city's deepest past. Alara, her heart hammering against her ribs, lit a lantern. The flame flickered, casting dancing shadows on the rough-hewn walls as she took the first step downward, instinctively assuming the lead. Her scholarly curiosity was now her compass, guiding them into the unknown. The passageway soon opened into a larger chamber, and their progress was immediately halted by the first puzzle. The way forward was blocked by a massive stone door, its surface inlaid with a complex mosaic of polished stones, forming a celestial map. But the map was wrong. Stars were out of place, constellations were broken, and the patterns were chaotic. Set into the wall beside it was a series of 12 rotating stone dials, each carved with a different astrological sign. Lyra immediately understood. "It's the night of the shattered sky," she whispered, her Archivist's knowledge coming to the fore. An ancient myth about a night of great turmoil when the stars themselves were said to have fallen and rearranged. Her hands flew over the dials, not with random guesswork, but with the certainty of someone reassembling a story she knew by heart. The scroll fragment in the Eastern Archive spoke of this. The correct alignment is the prophecy of the serpent's return. With a series of precise clicks, the final dial slid into place. The chaotic mosaic on the door shimmered and realigned itself into a perfect, harmonious map of the night sky, and the great door silently sank into the floor. Further in, they encountered a hallway where the floor was a checkerboard of seemingly identical stones. Kalin, ever cautious, tossed a small rock onto one of the tiles ahead. Instead of clattering, it passed straight through the stone, as if it were an illusion, disappearing into a black void below with a faint, echoing hiss. The path was a lethal illusion. This puzzle was one of faith and memory. Etched on the wall in nearly faded script was a line from a creation myth: "The righteous walk only where the light of truth has touched." Elara noticed that certain tiles had a faint, almost imperceptible phosphorescent glow, visible only if you tilted the lantern light at a specific angle. These glowing tiles formed a winding, non-linear path across the deadly gap. "It's the path of the seeker," Alara said, her voice filled with awe. "It's not a test of strength, but of observation and trust in knowledge." She led the way, placing her feet exactly on the glowing stones, with Lyra and Kalin following carefully in her footsteps, their trust in her eyesight and interpretation absolute. Each challenge they faced was drawn from a different legend or parable, a series of locks that could only be opened with the right key of cultural and historical understanding. Kalin's role evolved from mere protector to active participant. His knowledge of military history and ancient siege tactics helped them decipher a puzzle based on a famous battle formation, while his strength was needed to turn massive, rusted levers that had not moved in centuries. Lyra's expertise was their constant guide, her mind a living library of myth and symbol, and Alara, connecting the dots between Lyra's knowledge and the clues from her scroll, was the one who synthesized the information, who saw the patterns and made the intuitive leaps necessary to proceed. With every solved puzzle and every avoided trap, the dynamic between them solidified. The initial, fragile alliance forged in Lyra's office was being tempered in the quiet, pressurized darkness of the underground sanctum. They were no longer just a scholar, a historian, and an archivist thrown together by circumstance. They were becoming a single unit, a trio whose unique skills interlocked perfectly. Brief words of encouragement were exchanged in the gloom, a hand offered for balance on a narrow ledge, a shared look of relief after a particularly close call. The shared danger was stripping away their individual fears and reservations, replacing them with a hardened, mutual reliance. They were bound together now not just by a vow, but by the tangible experience of depending on one another for their very survival, moving deeper into the earth with a growing sense that what they were about to find would change everything. The grinding of the final stone mechanism faded into an echoing silence, and the three of them stepped through into a chamber that felt utterly detached from the world above. The air was still and heavy, tasting of ancient dust and a profound, watchful quiet. Alara raised her lantern high, its flame struggling against a darkness that seemed to swallow the light. Then, as her eyes adjusted, the walls themselves began to glow with a soft, inherent luminescence. They weren't just walls, they were a canvas, covered from floor to ceiling in breathtakingly detailed murals, painted with pigments that had somehow retained their vibrancy across countless centuries. The scenes were dynamic, epic, and horrifyingly clear. The murals did not show the glorious, singular deeds of the Maiar as the official histories recorded. Instead, they depicted a far more sinister narrative. In one vast panel, a majestic Maiar figure, radiant with power and light, was shown in a moment of deep contemplation. But coiled around the base of its throne, almost hidden in the artistic rendering of shadow, was a wispy, nebulous form with faint, pinprick eyes, a form that seemed to be whispering into the Maiar's ear. In another scene, two Maiar stood opposed, their hands raised as if to summon cataclysmic forces against one another, and behind each of them, woven into the very backdrop of the battlefield like a malevolent tapestry, were more of these shadowy entities, their postures not of observation, but of clear direction and manipulation. They were the conductors of a symphony of conflict, and the Maiar were their instruments. Lyra was the first to breathe the name, her voice a hushed exhalation of awe and dread. The Umbrals. She moved closer to the wall, her archivist's fingers hovering just above the paint, not daring to touch. The texts mentioned them only in fragments, as minor spirits of doubt or forgotten deities of twilight. But this shows them as puppet masters. Kalin stood rigid, his soldier's stance returned, his face pale in the eerie light. He wasn't looking at the art, he was seeing the implications. Every war, he muttered, almost to himself. The siege of crystal spires, the sundering of the realms, were they all just staged? It was Alara who connected the pieces into a devastating whole. She stood in the center of the room, turning slowly, her mind racing faster than her heart. The scroll from the library ruins had been a single sentence. This chamber was the entire book. The murals provided a visual timeline, a corroboration that was undeniable. She saw how the Umbrals would subtly influence a Maiar's pride, stoke its fears, or poison its alliances, all from the shadows. They didn't create the conflicts. They nurtured the seeds of discord that were already there, watering them until they erupted into full-scale war. The Great Wars were not the result of clashing ideologies or territorial disputes alone. They were a harvest, and the Umbrals were the farmers, reaping some unknown sustenance from the chaos and suffering they cultivated. This was no longer a theory. It was evidence, proof of a conspiracy that reached back to the dawn of recorded history, a conspiracy that had shaped the destiny of every living being. The weight of that knowledge was immense, a physical pressure in the silent chamber, but with that proof came a terrifying new urgency. The keepers of the Vale wanted this truth buried. The shadowy figures in the woods had tried to steal the map to this place. They would not stop. If they knew this chamber had been breached, they would come. They would destroy these murals, and they would destroy anyone who had seen them. They had to document this, and they had to do it now. Wordlessly, they sprang into action, their previous caution replaced by a frantic, shared purpose. Lyra pulled charcoal sticks and sheets of thin vellum from her pack, her hands moving with practiced efficiency as she began meticulously rubbing the images, transferring the intricate details onto paper. Kalin stood guard at the chamber's entrance, his ear cocked for any sound from the passageway they had just navigated, his knife held tight. Alara used a stylus and a wax tablet to furiously sketch the overall layout of the murals and jot down notes, trying to capture the narrative flow and the specific symbols associated with each umbral. The quiet chamber was filled with the soft scratching of charcoal, the rapid scraping of stylus on wax, and the ragged sound of their own breathing. They were no longer just explorers uncovering a secret. They were archivists in a race against time, desperately trying to preserve a truth that powerful forces had spent millennia erasing. The stakes of their quest had just been raised to unimaginable heights. They were no longer merely chasing a mystery. They were now the guardians of a revelation that could shatter the world. The heavy stone door ground shut behind them, sealing the ancient secrets of the chamber once more. But the cool night air of Eldoria offered no relief. They had only taken a few hurried steps from the temple's rear entrance, their satchels heavy with precious rubbings and notes, when the shadows around them began to move. Figures detached themselves from the darkness between the grand buildings, their forms coalescing into a silent, tightening circle. There were no weapons drawn, no shouted threats, only a calm, suffocating presence that blocked every potential escape route. And then, from their midst, a man stepped forward. He was not clad in dark leathers like his followers, but in robes of deep gray that seemed to drink the moonlight. This was Malachar. He moved with an unnerving grace, his face handsome and sharp-featured, but his eyes held a cold, calculating depth that felt ancient. A faint, almost pleasant smile played on his lips, a stark contrast to the predatory stillness of his posture. "You have been busy," he said, his voice a smooth, low baritone that carried easily in the quiet night. It was not an accusation, but a statement of fact, laced with a hint of amusement, as if he were a tutor addressing particularly industrious, but ultimately misguided, students. The Temple of the First Dawn is a place for quiet reflection, not for excavation. I trust you found what you were looking for. Kalin's hand instinctively went to his knife, and Lyra drew a sharp breath, but Alara placed a subtle hand on Kalin's arm, stopping him. She saw immediately that force was not an option here. Malachar's calm authority was a weapon far more effective than any blade. He commanded the space around him completely. They were outnumbered and outmatched. Her mind raced, discarding a dozen lies in a second. A complete denial would be useless. He knew they had been inside. The full truth would be a death sentence, It would confirm they had seen everything and had evidence. There was only one path, a partial truth, a carefully crafted piece of bait that might satisfy his curiosity just enough to grant them an opening. She met his gaze, forcing her own voice to remain steady, layering it with a scholar's earnest excitement. "We found stories," she said, letting a note of awe color her words. Legends painted on the walls, tales of the Maiar and their advisors, spiritual guides from the Twilight Realms. She deliberately used the older, more academic term for the Umbrals, making their discovery sound like a dusty theological footnote rather than an earth-shattering revelation. It's a fascinating cultural artifact, a unique depiction of their belief systems. We were documenting it for the historical archive. She gestured to her satchel, hoping the charcoal rubbings inside would be mistaken for simple academic sketches. Malachar's smile didn't falter, but his eyes narrowed almost imperceptibly, scanning her face for any flicker of deception. He took a slow step closer. "Advisors, guides, such gentle words for such potent forces," he murmured, his tone still conversational, almost friendly. "And did these stories say what these advisors gained from their counsel, what their true purpose was?" The question was a trap, delicately laid. He was testing the depth of their understanding. Elara walked right up to the edge of it without falling in. She shook her head, feigning scholarly frustration. "The narratives are fragmented, symbolic. It's hard to say for certain. It seems they were drawn to power, as such entities often are in myth. They are depicted as influencers, but the murals are unclear on their ultimate goal." It was a masterful deflection, acknowledging the Umbrals' presence while professing ignorance of their destructive, manipulative intent, the very core of the truth they had uncovered. For a long moment, Malachar was silent, his gaze shifting from Alara to the tense faces of Kalin and Lyra. The night seemed to hold its breath. Then he gave a slight, almost disappointed sigh. "A pity. The complete picture is so much more compelling." His words were a clear signal that he did not entirely believe her, that he knew they had seen more than they were admitting. But her performance had been convincing enough to create a sliver of doubt, to make outright violence here in the city streets a messy, inconvenient option. He had what he wanted, confirmation that they had accessed the chamber, and a gauge of how much they might truly know. With a graceful wave of his hand, the circle of shadows parted, creating a single, narrow path leading away from the temple. "The night is old, and you have your work to return to," he said, the dismissal clear in his tone. "Do be careful with your interpretations, scholar. History is not always a gentle subject. Some truths are sharp, and they cut those who handle them carelessly." The threat was veiled in courtesy, but it was unmistakable. They didn't wait for a second invitation. Walking as calmly as they could manage, they moved through the gap in the silent figures, feeling their cold eyes upon them until they turned a corner and broke into a run. The temporary relief of escape was instantly drowned by a cold wave of realization. They had gotten away, but they had also played right into his hands. By engaging with him, by offering even a sliver of information, Alara had confirmed their discovery and their interest. She hadn't just bought them time. She had alerted Malachar that they were not merely random explorers, but individuals who understood the significance of what they had found. The threat against them was no longer a general pursuit. It was now personal, focused, and far more dangerous. They had been graded and found to be a significant enough problem to warrant Malachar's direct attention. The hunt was now on in earnest. The narrow, winding streets of Eldoria felt like a cage after their encounter with Malachar. Every echo of a footstep, every flicker of a shadow from a passing lantern seemed to carry a threat. They did not return to Lyra's archives or seek shelter in an inn. They knew they had to vanish, and they had to do it immediately. The city's famed libraries, once a symbol of sanctuary, were now potential hunting grounds for the keepers of the Vale. Huddled in a deserted alleyway, the cold seeping through their cloaks, they held a frantic, whispered council. They had evidence of the conspiracy, but they lacked understanding. They knew the what, but not the why, and without that, their proof was just a collection of strange pictures. They needed insight, a perspective that could see through the layers of deception that had shrouded this truth for ages. It was Kalin, surprisingly, who offered the solution. The fear that had once made him a recluse was now channeled into a sharp, tactical focus. "We can't outrun them forever, not without a destination," he said, his voice low and urgent. "We need guidance from a source they cannot corrupt or influence." He spoke of a legend from his soldiering days, a tale told around campfires in hushed, reverent tones, the Oracle of the Peaks. It was said to reside in the highest, most inaccessible reaches of the Dragon's Tooth Mountains, a being of pure perception that could not be lied to, whose vision pierced through all illusions, both magical and mundane. It was a desperate, perhaps foolish hope, a journey into one of the most treacherous regions in the world, based on a campfire story, but it was the only hope they had. With Malachar's network undoubtedly already scouring every road out of the city, the brutal, unpredictable mountains represented their only chance to disappear completely. The decision was made. They would seek the Oracle. Their flight from Eldoria was a tense, silent affair under the cover of a moonless night. They used back alleys and drainage canals, moving like ghosts, their hearts pounding at every sound. By the time the first gray light of dawn touched the eastern sky, the majestic white walls of the city were far behind them, and the formidable, snow-capped peaks of the Dragon's Tooth range loomed ahead, an imposing barrier of rock and ice. The transition from the relative safety of the valley to the raw, punishing environment of the high mountains was immediate and brutal. The air grew thin and bitingly cold, each breath a sharp effort. The well-trodden paths gave way to unstable scree slopes and narrow, icy ledges that dropped away into dizzying, mist-shrouded abysses. The wind howled constantly, a relentless force that sought to steal both their warmth and their footing. The physical toll was immense, but the greater challenge was the constant, grinding test of their endurance, and most crucially, their trust in one another. Lyra, with her life spent among books, struggled the most with the sheer physicality of the climb, her strength flagging with every upward step. Elara's determination was a fierce flame, but even she was humbled by the mountain's indifference to their vital mission. A single misstep, a loose handhold, a hidden patch of black ice, any of these could mean a fatal plunge, and they all knew it. They were roped together, a literal tether of life, and that rope became a powerful symbol of their interdependence. They had to move as one, communicate constantly, and place their absolute faith in the person checking their footing or anchoring the line. It was here, in this crucible of shared survival, that Kalin's transformation became undeniable. The cynical historian, who had initially dismissed Alara's quest, was gone, replaced by a steadfast and fiercely protective guardian. His soldier's instincts, long buried under layers of academic disillusionment, resurfaced completely. He was always the one testing the stability of a ledge before signaling the others forward, the one spotting the safest route across a crevasse, the one who insisted on taking the most dangerous position on the rope. During one particularly harrowing traverse across a sheer rock face, a sudden, violent gust of wind tore Lyra's footing from beneath her. She screamed, swinging out over the void, her weight snapping against the rope that connected her to Kalin. Without a moment's hesitation, he braced himself against the rock, muscles straining, his boots digging into the ice as he absorbed the shocking force of her fall, holding the line taut and steady until she could scramble back to the ledge. His face was pale, his knuckles white, but his voice was calm and firm as he talked her through it. "I have you, just breathe, find your grip." Later, as they huddled in a small, shallow cave, trying to escape a blinding snow squall, he admitted the truth to Alara. "I was wrong," he said, his words barely audible over the shrieking wind. "I thought the past was a dead thing, something to be studied from a safe distance. But it's not, it's alive, it's this." He gestured out at the storm, at the mountain, at the two women relying on him. "It's the choices we make right now." Hiding from the truth didn't keep me safe. It just made me a prisoner in my own home. This is frightening, but it's real, and protecting this. Protecting you, it's the first honest work I've done in years. This was no longer the reluctant accomplice swayed by a compelling argument. This was a man who had fully embraced the cause as his own, who had found a purpose worth facing avalanches and assassins for. His doubt had been burned away by the cold and the danger, forged in the mountain's unforgiving heart into a core of unshakable commitment. He was no longer just a guide or a bodyguard. He was a true ally, and his growth solidified their trio into a far more resilient and determined unit, ready to face whatever awaited them at the peak. The climb to the Oracle Sanctuary was the final trial in a journey that had already pushed them to their absolute limits. The air was so thin, it burned their lungs with every gasp, and the path was little more than a treacherous goat track, winding along the edge of a sheer cliff face. When they finally reached the summit, they found not a grand temple, but a simple, natural cave mouth, framed by ancient, wind-gnarled trees. A profound silence hung over the place, a quiet so deep it felt like a physical presence. Stepping inside, they were met not by a wizened sage, but by a soft, ethereal light that seemed to emanate from the very walls of the cavern, and a voice that spoke not to their ears, but directly into their minds. It was a calm, genderless whisper that carried the weight of infinite ages, and it knew them instantly, addressing them by names they had not spoken aloud since leaving Eldoria. The oracle did not offer vague prophecies or cryptic rhymes. It spoke with a devastating, matter-of-fact clarity that left no room for doubt. It confirmed everything they had pieced together from the murals and the scroll. The Umbrals were real, but they were not gods or demons in any traditional sense. They were parasitic entities, ancient and utterly alien, that drew their sustenance from the psychic energy released by mortal conflict, the anguish of betrayal, the fury of battle, the despair of loss. To them, a war was not a tragedy, it was a harvest. The Great Wars had been their richest feasts, periods where their influence and power grew exponentially. And their methods were insidiously subtle. They did not command armies, they infiltrated minds. The Oracle revealed that the Umbrals had agents, willing or unwitting, embedded at every level of every major society. Court advisors whispering doubts into a king's ear, generals advocating for preemptive strikes, merchants sparking trade disputes, even scholars declaring certain fields of research heresy. Their network was a global infection, a shadowy symbiosis where they provided their agents with ambition, paranoia, or a sense of righteous purpose, and in return, they fed on the chaos that followed. This terrifying revelation was followed immediately by a grave warning that reshaped the entire nature of their mission. The Oracle's voice grew urgent, impressing upon them the immense fragility of the world's current state. The wounds of the last great war were still fresh. Trust between nations was a delicate, nascent thing. To reveal the truth now, to stand before the world and proclaim that their leaders, their heroes, and their very history had been manipulated by shadow-feeding parasites, would not bring enlightenment. It would shatter the fragile peace entirely. It would unleash a tsunami of paranoia and panic. People would turn on each other, seeing an Umbral agent in every neighbor who disagreed with them. Governments would collapse into witch hunts and internal purges. The resulting chaos and suspicion would, in effect, create a banquet of conflict, so vast it would empower the Umbrals beyond anything ever seen before. Their well-intentioned revelation could become the very thing that triggers the next, and perhaps final, world war. The weight of this moral dilemma settled upon Alara, Kalin, and Lyra like a mountain of stone. Their entire quest, up to this point, had been driven by the need to uncover the truth and reveal it to the world. That was the noble, just path. Now, the most enlightened being they had ever encountered was telling them that the most moral choice was paradoxically to stay silent. They were caught between the imperative of truth and the responsibility of consequence. To speak was to risk destroying the world with the very knowledge meant to save it. To remain silent was to become complicit in the ongoing deception, allowing the Umbrals to continue their work unchallenged. There was no clear, righteous path forward. Their mission was no longer a straightforward hunt for evidence. It had become a tightrope walk over an abyss, where every step had to be measured not just for its truth, but for its potential to cause catastrophic harm. They had to gather more proof, the Oracle insisted, but they had to do it with the utmost discretion, building an unassailable case while simultaneously working to quietly undermine the Umbral network, all without alerting the world to the terrifying reality hiding in its shadows. The quest for truth had just become a game of shadows within shadows, and the price of a misstep was unthinkable. The silence in the Oracle's cave was heavier than the mountain above them, filled not with peace, but with the immense weight of a terrible dilemma. The truth they carried was now a volatile weapon, and their noble quest felt suddenly fraught with peril, just as the crushing reality of their impossible choice threatened to overwhelm them. The ethereal light in the cavern pulsed softly, and a new series of images blossomed directly in their minds, a gift from the Oracle to guide their next step. They saw endless, shifting dunes under a merciless sun, and rising from the sands, a city of pale, sun-bleached stone built around a towering, Zigorate-like structure. They saw a vast, labyrinthine chamber deep beneath the earth, its shelves overflowing with clay jars, and within those jars, countless scrolls, their aged parchment covered in the same familiar, twisting script. The vision was as clear as it was specific. The desert city of Sunfall held a hidden archive, a trove of knowledge that could provide the deeper, more complete evidence they desperately needed to understand the full scope of the Umbral threat. As the vision faded, leaving the stark image of the desert city burned into their thoughts, a wave of grim determination settled over the group. The path forward was clear, yet it led into one of the most inhospitable environments imaginable. The Dragon's Tooth Mountains were a trial of ice and wind. Sunfall would be a trial of fire and thirst. The journey would be long, arduous, and filled with new dangers, both natural and unnatural. It was in this moment of sober contemplation that Alara found her voice. She looked at her companion's Kalin, his face still marked by the physical strain of the climb, but his eyes now steady with purpose, and Lyra, who seemed to be mentally cataloging every known fact about the Sunfall region, her scholar's mind already wrestling with the practicalities of the task ahead. She spoke not with grand, booming declarations, but with a quiet, fierce conviction that filled the small space. "I know the burden the Oracle has given us," she began, her voice soft yet unwavering. To know a truth that could shatter the world, if spoken too soon, is a heavy thing to carry. It would be easier to turn back, to hide this knowledge away, and tell ourselves that ignorance is a price worth paying for peace. She paused, letting the seductive simplicity of that option hang in the air for a moment before dismissing it. But that kind of peace is a lie. It is a cage built by the very shadows we seek to expose. A peace maintained by ignorance is not peace at all. It is simply a delay of the inevitable. The Umbrals feed on that ignorance. They thrive in the spaces between what we know and what we fear. She took a step closer to her friends, her gaze intense. What we do now, this difficult and dangerous path we choose to walk, it is not about causing chaos. It is about building a foundation strong enough to bear the weight of the truth when it is finally revealed. The scrolls in Sunfall are not just more pieces of the puzzle. They are the context, the understanding we need to one day stand before the world and not just reveal the disease, but offer the cure. We go to Sunfall not to gather weapons, but to gather wisdom. We do this because truth, no matter how painful, is the only light that can truly dispel these shadows forever. Her words were a rallying cry that acknowledged the fear and the difficulty without being defeated by it. It reframed their mission from a reckless unveiling to a solemn, responsible gathering of strength. It was a speech that solidified their resolve not through promises of glory, but through a shared recognition of their profound responsibility. The hesitation in their eyes was replaced by a hardened agreement. The course was set. They would descend from the frozen peaks and turn their faces toward the scorching sun, their resolve tempered by wisdom and their purpose clearer than ever before. The harsh desert lands awaited. The descent from the icy peaks was a journey into a different kind of stark beauty and a far more insidious kind of danger. The mountains had been a brutal, honest adversary. Their threats were clear: the cliff, the cold, the fall. The Golden Sea Desert, which now stretched before them in a vast, shimmering expanse of heat haze, was a master of deception. Its dangers were hidden, patient, and relentless. The first challenge was the sheer, oppressive weight of the sun, a white hot orb in a bleached sky that seemed to leach the very moisture from their thoughts. Their water, carefully rationed from the last mountain streams, became more precious than the scrolls in their packs. Every sip was a calculated decision, a tiny investment in the next hour of life. It was Lyra, the Archivist, who unexpectedly became their most vital guide. The knowledge she had once applied to deciphering faded ink and cracked pottery now found a new, urgent purpose. She taught them to rid the desert itself. She showed them how to find the faint, almost invisible depressions in the sand that might indicate a deep-rooted plant below the surface, its thick, pulpy stems holding precious liquid. She identified the specific, scraggly shape of a rock spine bush, whose tiny, bitter berries could stave off the worst pangs of thirst. Her understanding of ancient trade routes, culled from 100 different maps, allowed her to navigate not by prominent landmarks, which were few and far between, but by the subtle lay of the land, the color and consistency of the sand, and the position of the sun and stars. Her academic mind had become their key to survival, proving that knowledge was not just power, but sustenance itself. Kalin's role evolved from protector to pillar. His strength was no longer just for fighting, it was for enduring. He shouldered the heaviest pack without complaint, his broad frame casting a sliver of shade that the others would take turns walking in during the worst heat of the day. When a sudden, howling sandstorm descended upon them with little warning, it was Kalin who physically anchored them, driving their tent spikes deep into the harder ground beneath the shifting dunes, and forming a human wall between the stinging, blinding sand and his companions. He worked in silent, grueling shifts, digging out their supplies after the storm had passed, his muscles burning with exhaustion, but his resolve unbroken. He was their constant, their unmovable center in a world of fluid, threatening motion, and Alara, whose leadership had once been about deciphering texts and inspiring action, was now faced with a series of gut-wrenching, immediate decisions. Leadership in the desert was a brutal arithmetic of risk and resources. One afternoon, their water skins were frighteningly light. Lyra believed she had spotted the signs of a water source a mile to the east, a significant detour from their plotted course. Kalin argued they should press on, believing a known oasis was only half a day's march ahead on their current path. Both options carried terrible risks. A wasted mile in the wrong direction could be a death sentence if the source was dry, but pushing forward on faith could lead them to an oasis that was nothing more than a mirage. The weight of the choice settled solely on Alara's shoulders. She looked at Lyra's sun, chapped lips, and Kalin's weary eyes, and she made the call. They would trust Lyra's signs and detour east. The mile felt like 10. The silence was thick with tension, and the unspoken fear that her decision had doomed them all. Then they found it. Not a gushing spring, but a damp patch of sand in the shade of a large rock. It took an hour of desperate digging with their hands, but eventually, a trickle of muddy, life-giving water began to seep into the hole. It wasn't much, but it was enough. In that moment, Alara learned that the toughest calls weren't about being right. They were about bearing the responsibility of being wrong and having the courage to make the next choice anyway. Each decision, from rationing their food to choosing the pace of their march, was a thread in the fragile rope that was keeping them alive, and she was the one holding both ends. The first sight of Sunfall, rising from the shimmering heat of the desert, was a vision of stark, forbidding beauty. The city was carved from the same pale, sun-bleached stone as the dunes that surrounded it, its buildings low and massive to withstand the scorching winds. At its heart loomed the structure from the oracle's vision, a great zigurate, its stepped sides climbing toward the heavens, a monument to a power they now knew was anything but divine. The air itself felt different here, not just hot, but heavy with a sense of watchfulness, as if the very sand beneath their feet was reporting their presence. This was not a city of open forums and scholarly debate like Eldoria. This was a place of secrets, guarded fiercely. Their initial, cautious inquiries in the crowded, dusty marketplaces confirmed their worst fears. The Zigorate was not a public archive or a historical site. It was the absolute heart of the city, a temple devoted to a faith they had never encountered. The people of Sunfall spoke of their guardians in hushed, reverent tones, calling them the children of the twilight, a sect that worshipped the unseen guides. To Alara, Kalin, and Lyra, hearing the Umbral entities referred to as benevolent guides was a chilling distortion of the truth they had seen in the murals. These were not mere guards, they were devout worshippers, a fanatical sect that venerated the very parasites they were trying to expose. Gaining access through simple request or scholarly pretense was impossible. The temple's inner sanctum, the likely location of the archive, would be open only to the faithful, especially during their most sacred rituals. For 2 tense days, they observed the rhythms of the temple from a rented room with a view of the main gates, their hopes fading as they witnessed the absolute control the sect maintained. The acolytes moved in synchronized, silent processions, their faces hidden deep within hooded robes of deep indigo, a color that seemed to drink the relentless sunlight. It was Lyra, piecing together snippets of conversation and ancient liturgical texts she had cross-referenced, who discovered the key. The sect was preparing for the rite of the Veiled Star, a major ceremony held only once a season. It was a night of supposed communion, where the most devoted acolytes would enter the inner sanctum to receive the whispers of the guides. For outsiders, it was the most impenetrable night of the year. For Elara, it presented a terrifying, narrow window of opportunity. She laid out the plan with a calmness she did not feel, her voice low and steady in the close, hot confines of their room. We don't break in, we walk in, we become them. The audacity of it left Kalin and Lyra speechless. They would need to acquire the specific robes of the acolytes, learn the precise choreography of their movements, and mimic the silent, reverent demeanor that defined the sect. They would have to infiltrate the ceremony itself, moving within inches of true believers who would instantly recognize any hesitation, any flaw in their performance. The margin for error was zero. A single misstep, a single glance held for a moment too long, would not merely see them ejected. Discovery meant being delivered to the very entities they sought to undermine, with consequences they could only imagine in their darkest fears. The preparation was a frantic race against the setting sun. Kalin, using skills from a past life he rarely discussed, managed to acquire 3 of the indigo robes from a laundering facility behind the temple, his movements a shadow in the alleyways. Meanwhile, Lyra drilled them relentlessly on the few fragments of ritual movement she had observed and memorized the specific way the acolytes held their hands clasped, the slow, measured pace of their steps, the exact angle at which they bowed their heads at certain intervals. There was no room for discussion, no room for debate. They had to embody these roles completely, surrendering their own identities to the illusion. As they pulled on the heavy, unfamiliar robes, the fine desert dust seeming to cling to the fabric, the reality of their gamble settled upon them. They were not just putting on a disguise, they were burying themselves within the enemy's skin, trusting that their courage and their carefully rehearsed lies would be enough to shield them from a faith built on darkness. The fading light outside their window signaled it was time. They took a final, steadying breath, their eyes meeting in a silent pact of mutual trust, and stepped out into the twilight to join the flowing river of blue robes heading toward the Zigorate's ominous, open mouth. The oppressive silence within the Zigorate was a living thing, thick with the scent of strange incense and the murmured prayers of 100 hooded figures. Moving in the slow, processional gait Lyra had drilled into them, Alara felt every nerve in her body screaming. The indigo robe was stiflingly hot, its deep hood limiting her vision to the stone floor just ahead and the hem of the robe in front of her. They were a single thread in a river of blue weaving its way deeper into the heart of the temple, toward the inner sanctum where the archive was said to be kept. Every step was an act of sheer will, a forced calm over a heart threatening to beat its way out of her chest. Beside her, she could sense the rigid tension in Kalin's frame, his soldier's instincts rebelling against the passive, reverent slowness of their movement. They passed through an immense archway into the sanctum, a circular chamber where the air hummed with a low, resonant chant. The walls were lined not with shelves, but with deep, shadowed niches, each holding clay jars sealed with wax, the archive they had risked everything to reach. The high priest stood at the center, before a brazier of glowing coals, his voice a hypnotic monotone as he led the congregation in their rites. This was their moment. The plan was simple. During the peak of the ceremony, when all attention was fixed on the central ritual, they would break from the formation, grab a jar each, and melt back into the crowd before slipping out. It was a gamble on speed and the overwhelming sensory focus of the faithful. They took their positions, a silent agreement passing between them, as the chanting reached a fever pitch, and the high priest raised his arms to the ceiling. Alara gave the slightest of nods. It was now, but just as Kalin began to turn toward the nearest niche, a hand clamped down on his shoulder from behind. The grip was firm, not the gentle touch of a fellow acolyte. He froze, a guard, his face also hidden, but his bearing one of authority, leaned in close. The man's voice was a low, suspicious growl, meant only for Kalin's ear. Your step is too heavy for a scribe. Your posture is that of a soldier. Lower your hood, now. For a heart-stopping second, time seemed to suspend. Then, with a reluctance that screamed of impending disaster, Kalin slowly reached for his hood. As the fabric fell back, revealing his face, the guard's eyes, visible through the slit in his own hood, widened in shock and instant recognition. Kalin. The guard hissed, the name of venomous whisper. The deserter, here, the past Kalin had tried to bury, had just risen from the sands of Sunfall to confront him. In that single, exposed moment, the carefully constructed illusion of their infiltration shattered completely. Chaos erupted. Kalin didn't hesitate. His training took over. He drove his elbow back into the guard's midsection, breaking the man's grip and shoving him hard into the line of chanting acolytes beside them. The serene ritual exploded into shouts of alarm and confusion. "Go now," Kalin roared at Alara and Lyra, his voice cutting through the din, no longer bothering with the pretense of silence. The plan was in ashes. Now it was pure survival. Alara's mind raced, every instinct screaming to fight alongside him, but she knew their priorities: the scrolls. The truth, while Kalin became a whirlwind of controlled violence, drawing the attention of the other guards now converging on them, she and Lyra acted. Lyra, with the unerring eye of an archivist, darted to a specific niche, her fingers scrabbling at the wax seal of a jar. She didn't grab randomly. She selected one whose markings matched the most complex sigils from the Eldoria murals. She pulled a single, tightly wound scroll from within and shoved it into the folds of her robe. "This is it. We have to move," she yelled to Alara. The exit was blocked by a wall of enraged acolytes and guards. Kalin met Alara's eyes across the chaotic room, and in that split second, a silent, terrible understanding passed between them. There was only one way out. "The eastern corridor. It leads outside," he shouted, parrying a blow from a ceremonial staff. "I'll draw them west. Meet at the third marker." He was referring to a stone cairn they had identified on the outskirts of the city as a potential emergency rendezvous point. Before Alara could protest, before she could even process the immense risk of what he was doing, Kalin let out a fierce battle cry and charged directly into the largest group of guards, not to fight them, but to become an irresistible target, a blazing diversion that would pull every enemy in the room toward him and away from them. It worked. The sect's fury focused entirely on the one exposed enemy in their midst. In the confusion, Alara and Lyra, their hoods pulled tight, were able to slip into the shadowed eastern passageway, unnoticed in the frantic pursuit of Kalin. They ran, their footsteps echoing in the suddenly empty corridor, the sounds of the struggle fading behind them. They had the scroll, the key piece of evidence they had come for, but the cost of that success was a devastating separation. They were fleeing into the unknown desert night, alone, with no idea if Kalin could possibly fight his way free of an entire temple of fanatics. The personal stakes of their quest, which had always been about saving the world, were now terrifyingly immediate. It was no longer an abstract war against shadows. It was about the life of their friend, a life that had been gambled for a scrap of parchment and a chance at the truth. The cold desert night air was a sharp contrast to the stifling heat and terror they had just escaped. Alara and Lyra reached the third marker, a small, lonely cairn of stones on the outskirts of Sunfall, their lungs burning and their robes torn from their frantic flight. For what felt like an eternity, they crouched in the lee of the stones, listening for pursuit, their eyes straining into the darkness for any sign of Kalin. The only sounds were the mournful sigh of the wind over the dunes and the frantic pounding of their own hearts. Hope was a fragile, dwindling flame. Then, a shadow detached itself from a larger dune, moving with a familiar, limping gait. It was him. Kalin stumbled into their makeshift camp, his face bruised and bleeding from a cut above his eye, his borrowed acolyte robe missing, but he was alive. The relief was so potent, it left them momentarily speechless, able only to clasp his arm in a wordless affirmation of survival. He had fought his way free, using the temple's own labyrinthine corridors against his pursuers, but the cost of their success was written on his face and in his weary stance. They were reunited, but they were far from safe. under the feeble light of the moon, Lyra carefully unrolled the scroll they had risked so much to obtain. The parchment was brittle, the ink a faded brown that was difficult to read, but the symbols were unmistakably part of the same visual language they had seen in Eldoria. This was not a historical record, it was a communique, a set of instructions. Working together, their three areas of expertise, converging: Alara's intuitive grasp of mythic patterns, Lyra's deep knowledge of archaic scripts, and Kalin's understanding of military logistics. They began to piece together the horrifying message. The scroll outlined a plan, coldly precise in its detail, to sabotage the upcoming peace summit of Veridia. The summit was a beacon of fragile hope, a gathering of delegates from every major faction that had been scarred by the last Great War. It was meant to be a historic moment of reconciliation, a chance to sign lasting treaties and dismantle the old alliances of mistrust. The Umbral Communique treated this noble endeavor not as a threat to be countered, but as an opportunity to be exploited. The plan was diabolical in its simplicity. It did not call for armies to be raised or for cities to be besieged. Instead, it detailed a series of subtle, calculated provocations designed to be executed by their embedded agents among the delegates' own retinues. A stolen personal seal used to forge an incendiary letter here, a whispered lie about a secret troop mobilization there, a key diplomat's food secretly drugged to make them irritable and irrational during negotiations. Each action was a small, precise cut, intended to make the factions turn on each other at the exact moment they were supposed to be building trust. The goal was to make peace itself erupt into violence, to transform the summit hall into a brand new battlefield. The resulting conflict wouldn't be called a war, it would be a tragic breakdown of diplomacy, but the psychic fallout, the rage, the betrayal, the shattered hope, would be a feast for the Umbrals, a harvest more potent than any outright battle could provide. The silence that followed their decoding was heavier than the desert night. The truth they now held was no longer a relic of the past. It was a ticking clock, counting down to a catastrophe. The abstract enemy they had been chasing had just announced its next move with terrifying clarity. The urgency was a physical force, tightening around their chests. They had to get to Veridia. They had to warn them, but the scroll also served as a brutal reminder of their enemy's reach. The Umbrals had agents everywhere. Who among the delegates could they trust? A guard's captain, a trusted advisor. The warning they carried could easily be intercepted and turned against them, branding them as conspirators themselves and accelerating the very chaos they hoped to prevent. Veridia wasn't just their destination. It was almost certainly a trap, a stage that Malachar and his masters had already prepared. To walk into that city was to step onto a chessboard where every piece, except their own, was controlled by the opposition. Yet the alternative was unthinkable. To do nothing, to hide with their knowledge, would be to become passive witnesses to the world's undoing. They had not come this far, had not lost so much and risked more, to surrender at the final moment. Kalin, wiping blood from his brow, was the first to speak, his voice gravelly but firm. "We go," he said, his statement simple and absolute. There was no debate, no weighing of options. The path was clear, no matter how dangerous. Their journey was no longer about discovery, it was about intervention. They would travel to the heart of the gathering storm, armed only with a fragile piece of parchment and the desperate hope that the light of truth could be seen before the shadows closed in for good. The journey to Veridia was a tense and hurried trek across lands still scarred by the last great war. Every burned-out farmstead and overgrown trench was a silent reminder of the stakes, a constant, grim backdrop to their race against the Umbral timeline. They moved with a new caution, no longer just wary of natural dangers or overt pursuit, but of every stranger on the road, every too friendly face at a wayside inn. The knowledge that their enemy could be anyone had cast a pall of suspicion over the world itself. It was in this state of heightened alertness that they first noticed they were being followed. A lone figure had been matching their pace for half a day, always staying at a distance, a persistent shadow on the horizon that neither gained nor fell behind. Kalin, his instincts honed by their recent trials, insisted they set an ambush at a narrow river crossing, ready to confront this potential threat head-on. The man who walked into their trap, however, made no move to fight. He simply stopped, his hands held open and away from the worn sword at his hip. He was lean and weathered, with the tired eyes and cautious posture of someone who had seen too much battlefield logic up close. He introduced himself as Finn, a former sergeant in the King's Army of the Northern Reach, a unit that had been decimated in a famously pointless and brutal skirmish near the war's end. "I'm not your enemy," he said, his voice a low, gravelly thing. "I've been tracking you since Sunfall. I heard whispers in the taverns there about outsiders asking dangerous questions, about a trio that fled the temple. I need to know if your questions are the same as mine." It was around their campfire that night, under a canopy of indifferent stars, that Finn shared his story. It was not a tale of grand battles or heroic charges, but of a slow, creeping madness. He described his company, a tight-knit group of soldiers who had fought together for years, suddenly turning on itself in the final days of the war. It started with small things: a trusted scout bringing back completely erroneous information that led them into an ambush, a reliable quartermaster suddenly failing to secure adequate supplies, creating resentment and hunger among the ranks. Then came the whispers. He described how his commanding officer, a rational and compassionate man, became increasingly paranoid, convinced his own lieutenants were plotting against him, issuing contradictory orders that sowed chaos and got good soldiers killed for no reason. The official report called it battle fatigue, a collective breakdown under pressure. Finn said, the firelight etching the bitterness on his face. But I was there. I saw the look in their eyes. It wasn't fatigue. It was like a coldness had settled over them. They were themselves, but it was as if their worst impulses, their deepest fears, were the only things left in charge. His own best friend, he explained, had accused him of treason during a night watch, attacking him in a blind rage based on a conversation that had never happened. Finn was forced to disarm him and flee his own unit to avoid being executed as a scapegoat for a disaster that had been engineered by unseen hands. His story was a chilling, ground-level confirmation of everything they had learned in the abstract. He had not seen shadowy entities or read ancient scrolls. He had lived the Umbral strategy of erosion and saw how it could make an entire command structure tear itself apart from the inside. His first-hand account lent a terrible human credibility to their cause, transforming their theoretical mission into something visceral and immediate. Yet, his alliance was a double-edged sword. The trauma that made him a believer also made him deeply skeptical and difficult. Having been betrayed by the very structure he had sworn to serve, he trusted no one's motives at face value, not even theirs. He constantly questioned Elara's plans, challenging the wisdom of walking directly into the lion's den of Veridia. You think walking up to the high and mighty delegates with a story about shadow monsters is going to work? He'd grunt, "They'll throw you in a dungeon before you finish your first sentence. They live in a world of politics and power. They won't understand a war that's fought with whispers." He argued for more direct, violent solutions, identifying and eliminating suspected Umbral agents before they could act, a tactic that horrified Alara and Lyra with its potential for tragic error. Alara found her leadership constantly tested in this new, more volatile dynamic. She couldn't simply command Finn's obedience. She had to earn his trust and carefully navigate around his skepticism to keep the group focused and united. She listened to his objections seriously, acknowledging the brutal logic of his experiences without surrendering to his cynicism. "Your way is what they expect, Finn," she told him one evening after a particularly tense debate. "They feed on the chaos of violence and suspicion. If we start acting like them, making accusations without proof, and striking from the shadows, we become just another part of the problem. We have to be better. We have to be the proof that a different way is possible." She began to leverage his military mind, giving him tasks that utilized his skills, having him scout ahead to assess the security of their route, or plan their entry into the heavily guarded city, making him feel valued not as a blunt instrument, but as a strategic partner. Slowly, through patience and a shared sense of purpose, she began to weave his hardened pragmatism into the fabric of their group, transforming a potential source of division into a tougher, more resilient whole. They were no longer just scholars and a historian. They were now a quartet, a blend of idealism, knowledge, experience, and grim resolve, marching together toward a city on the brink. The first sight of Veridia was less a welcoming vision and more a display of tightly controlled paranoia. The city, built on a series of terraced hills surrounding a placid lake, should have been a picture of serene beauty. Instead, it was a fortress preparing for a siege. High walls that were normally open were now lined with guards from a dozen different nations, their colorful uniforms and banners creating a jarring mosaic of distrust. Checkpoints choked every major artery into the city, with soldiers scrutinizing travel papers with a suspicion that felt personal. The air itself was thick with a palpable, nervous energy, a low hum of unresolved grievances and barely concealed hostility hanging over the bustling streets. Delegations from formerly warring factions kept to their own distinct sectors, their interactions limited to stiff, formal greetings under the watchful eyes of armed escorts. The Umbral plan was already working. The foundation for peace was cracking under the weight of manufactured tension. Understanding immediately that they could not simply storm the gates with their wild story, the group made a critical decision to split their efforts, a strategy that leveraged each of their unique strengths against the multifaceted threat. Elara's path was the most direct, and in many ways the most perilous. She would take the front door, using the language of diplomacy and academia to try and pierce the bureaucratic armor surrounding the delegates. Her target was Lord Thuron, a senior delegate from a neutral coastal nation known for his scholarly pursuits and his published criticisms of the war's more senseless tragedies. Getting to him, however, required navigating a gauntlet of secretaries, aides, and protocol officers, each one a potential barrier, or worse, a hidden agent of the enemy. Meanwhile, Kalin, Lyra, and Finn melted into the tense underbelly of the city, their mission one of shadows and whispers. Their goal was to gather the kind of intelligence that could not be found in official meeting minutes. The rumor, the anomaly, the telltale sign of a hand guiding events from the darkness. Kalin, with his knowledge of military logistics and guard rotations, took to the taverns and barracks frequented by the soldiers and guardsmen. He listened for discontent, for strange orders, for any mention of officers acting out of character. The same subtle signs of manipulation that Finn had described from his own experience. Lyra positioned herself within the city's sprawling central archive and messenger halls, the crossroads of all official and unofficial communication. With her archivist's eye, she pored over public bulletins, tracked the movement of couriers between delegations, and listened for the whispers of scribes and clerks. She was looking for discrepancies, for a letter that arrived too quickly, a report whose details didn't align with known facts, any tiny thread in the information web that seemed pulled out of place by an unseen hand. Finn's role was the most dangerous. He became a ghost in the city's less reputable districts, the places where spies and sellswords gathered. His military bearing allowed him to blend in with the other mercenaries looking for work during the summit, and his personal trauma gave him a radar for the same cold, calculating energy he had witnessed in his corrupted comrades. He engaged in careful conversations, trading war stories and subtly probing for anyone who seemed to be following a script, anyone with unusually detailed knowledge of the delegates' private fears and insecurities. Back in the polished marble halls of the delegate quarters, Alara was engaged in her own delicate battle. Her audience with Lord Thuron was not a formal meeting, but a carefully orchestrated, chance encounter in a garden courtyard during his daily walk. She approached him not as an accuser, but as a fellow scholar, complimenting a recent treatise he had written on ancient trade routes. She spoke of history, of patterns that repeat, and of the importance of understanding the root causes of conflict, not just its symptoms. She saw a flicker of interest in his eyes, a scholar's curiosity that transcended the diplomat's caution. Slowly, carefully, she began to weave their discoveries into the conversation, framing them not as a fantastical story of shadow monsters, but as a historical pattern of manipulation, of how external forces have always sought to profit by turning allies into adversaries. She presented their evidence not as a conclusive truth, but as a concerning pattern that merited discreet investigation, appealing to his intellect and his stated desire for a lasting peace. She was planting a seed, hoping the soil was not already poisoned. The intelligence the others gathered began to paint a sinister picture. Kalin heard rumors of a guards captain in the Athelian delegation who had suddenly changed the nightly passwords without clear authorization, creating confusion and suspicion among the rank and file. Lyra discovered a curious anomaly. Several messages supposedly sent from the Northern Reach delegation bore slight stylistic differences in the script, suggesting a forger was at work, manufacturing discord. Finn, in a smoke-filled tavern, overheard a pair of off-duty sellswords joking about an easy job involving a spilled drink and a misplaced luggage trunk at the Elven delegation's residence, a seemingly petty act that could be designed to create a major diplomatic insult. Piece by piece, they were gathering not proof of the Umbrals themselves, but proof of their method. They were mapping the machinery of sabotage, seeing the gears and levers that were being pulled to push the summit toward disaster. Each tiny piece of information was a potential key to preventing a specific part of the plan, but time was slipping away like sand through their fingers. The opening ceremony was mere hours away, and they were surrounded by enemies they could not clearly see, racing to convince a world that was primed to doubt everything they said. The private garden where Alara met Lord Thuron was an oasis of cultivated calm, a stark contrast to the seething tension beyond its manicured hedges. She had chosen her words with the precision of a master jeweler, carefully setting each piece of evidence into the framework of his own published works on historical manipulation. She spoke of the subtle erosion of trust, the patterns of provocation that mirrored ancient conflicts, and the economic and political instability that always seemed to benefit a hidden few. Lord Thuron listened, his initial polite curiosity gradually hardening into a focused, grave attention. He did not dismiss her as a fanatic. He saw the chilling logic in her historical parallels. "You're suggesting," he said slowly, his voice low, "that we are not merely failing to make peace. You believe we are being actively prevented from doing so." It was a moment of breathtaking connection, a crack in the fortress of diplomatic skepticism. Alara felt a surge of hope. Perhaps a single voice of reason within the inner circle could be enough to the air itself seemed to tear. A crossbow bolt, fired from a high window in an adjacent building, hissed through the space where Lord Thuron's head had been a half-second before. It was not aim but pure, unthinking instinct that saved him. He had chosen that exact moment to lean forward, intent on her words, to examine a sketch she had made of the Umbral sigil. The bolt thudded into the wooden bench between them with a sickening finality, its steel tip buried deep in the grain. For a single, suspended heartbeat, there was only the sound of the disturbed leaves settling. Then chaos erupted. Elara acted without thought, shoving the stunned delegate to the ground behind the stone bench as a second bolt shattered a terracotta pot where he had been standing. Shouts echoed from the perimeter as his personal guards, finally realizing the threat, converged on the garden. The would-be assassin had chosen their moment perfectly, during a shift change when vigilance was at its lowest. From their hiding place, Elara and Lord Thuron watched the frantic search, the cold reality of the attempt settling over them like a shroud. This was not a random act of violence. It was a targeted, precise strike, designed to eliminate the one delegate who was most open to hearing their warning. The Umbrals were not just planning for the future. Their agents were already in motion. Their play for the summit had begun. Back in their cramped rented room, the mood was grim. Kalin, Lyra, and Finn returned from their own intelligence, gathering missions just as a shaken Alara recounted the attempt on Lord Thuron's life. Their individual reports dovetailed into a terrifyingly coherent picture of an imminent, multi-pronged assault. Kalin had confirmed the rogue guard's captain was planning to lose a key to the armory storage. Lyra's analysis showed forged letters of insult were already in the courier system, timed to arrive just before the ceremony. Finn's contacts revealed whispers of a coordinated disturbance planned for the ceremony's climax, something involving smoke and confusion. The pieces were all in place. The opening ceremony wasn't just a symbolic event. It was the chosen battlefield. The entire diplomatic gathering was poised to become a slaughterhouse or a riot, a single, catastrophic event that would shatter the peace for generations. The old plan, of careful, discreet whispers to sympathetic ears, was now a fantasy. It had died in that garden with the thud of a crossbow bolt. They had run out of time and out of safe options. They were surrounded by enemies wearing friendly faces, and the institutions meant to provide security were likely compromised. Sitting in the dim light, surrounded by their fragile scrolls and notes, Elara made the call. Her voice was quiet, but it carried a steel that brooked no argument. We cannot fight shadows with shadows anymore. If we try to work through the channels they control, we will be silenced, one by one. Our only advantage is the truth itself, and the only stage large enough is the opening ceremony itself. The audacity of the proposal left the room silent. To step onto that platform before every leader, every general, every citizen and reporter, and unveil a conspiracy of shadow entities feeding on war, it was beyond bold. It was potentially suicidal. It could be seen as the ravings of lunatics, a desperate act that would itself trigger the panic they feared. It could give the Umbral agents the perfect excuse to brand them as terrorists and cut them down on the spot. But it was also the only move left that was theirs alone. It was a gamble that the raw, shocking power of their evidence, presented directly to the world without filter, could cut through the layers of deception and reach the people underneath. They would force the Umbrals into the light. They would make their enemy react on a global stage. It was a decision born of absolute necessity, a desperate lunge for the only lever within their reach, knowing it could either stop the machine or be utterly crushed by it. The risk of chaos was immense, but the certainty of disaster, if they did nothing, was far, far greater. The final hours before the ceremony were a blur of frantic, whispered preparation within the small, shuttered room they had rented near the summit hall. The air was thick with tension and the scent of old paper as Lyra and Finn carefully unrolled their most critical evidence, the charcoal rubbings from Eldoria and the stolen Sunfall scroll, laying them out on a rough wooden table like a general's battle map. Their plan was fragile, a house of cards built on the desperate hope that the raw, shocking truth could topple a mountain of lies. Alara was silently rehearsing the words she would say, the precise order in which she would present the symbols, the murals, the military communique, building her case point by devastating point. Kalin was meticulously checking the fastenings on their packs, ensuring a quick escape route was memorized by all, his soldier's mind already anticipating the violent reaction their revelation would likely provoke. It was in this charged silence that the door, which Kalin had barred himself, simply swung open without a sound. No lock snapped, no wood splintered. It merely opened, as if inviting a guest, and there he stood, framed in the doorway against the dim light of the hallway. Malachar. He wore the same elegant gray robes, but here, in their cramped sanctuary, he seemed larger, his presence sucking the air from the room and filling it with a glacial cold. He did not smile. His sharp, handsome features were arranged in an expression of weary, almost parental disappointment. "You have shown remarkable tenacity," he began, his voice that same smooth, hypnotic baritone, but it now carried an undercurrent of immense, ancient power that vibrated in their bones. To have come this far, to have pieced together so much, it is a testament to your will, a will that is being tragically wasted. His eyes, that cold, calculating depth, swept over their evidence on the table, not with alarm, but with the mild curiosity of a scholar examining a mildly interesting but incorrect thesis. He knew every piece. He had likely written some of them. He took a single step into the room, and the shadows in the corners seemed to deepen and coil toward him. But you are thinking too small. You see this as a battle between truth and lies, light and shadow. How quaint. This is about evolution. This is about order emerging from the beautiful chaos you so fear. He extended a hand, not in threat, but in offer, his gaze fixed on Alara. The world you wish to save is a garden of unruly, screaming children, forever on the brink of tearing itself apart. We are the gardeners, we prune, we guide, we bring a purpose to the madness. Join us, your mind, your dedication. It would be valued. You would not be a servant, but a partner. You could help us shape a new, more stable world from the ashes of the old one. Imagine having a hand in steering the course of history itself, rather than being merely its chronicler. The offer hung in the air, seductive and terrible. It was not an offer of mere wealth or title, but of meaning on a cosmic scale. It was a chance to be part of the engine of history, to trade the frustrating, dangerous struggle for truth, for the absolute certainty of power. He was offering her a seat at the table where the real decisions were made. For a heartbeat, the immense weight of their mission, the sheer impossibility of it, made the temptation feel like a relief. To stop fighting, to finally understand, but as she looked from Malachar's offered hand to the faces of her friends, to Lyra's unwavering resolve, to Finn's hardened skepticism, to Kalin's steadfast loyalty, she saw the true cost of that bargain. It was not just her silence he wanted, it was her complicity. It was an agreement to see people not as individuals, but as crops to be harvested, their suffering reduced to mere sustenance. The clarity that had driven her from the dusty library ruins returned with the force of a tidal wave. She did not raise her voice. She did not need to. Her words were quiet, simple, and carried the weight of her entire being. "You offer me a world built on a foundation of lies," she said, her eyes locked on his. "You offer me power that comes from the suffering of others. That is not order. That is a prison for the soul. My commitment is not to power, and it is not to silence. My commitment is to the truth, and the truth is that every being, every single one, deserves the right to its own destiny, free from the whispers of shadows like you. I will not join you. I will defy you. I will stand before everyone in that hall today, and I will tell them exactly what you are." The pleasant mask on Malachar's face vanished. The air in the room grew so cold, their breath misted. The disappointment in his eyes crystallized into something infinitely older and more malicious. The offer was withdrawn, replaced by the naked reality of his nature. "A pity," he whispered, and the word was like the scraping of a tombstone. Such potential, extinguished for a sentimental ideal. "You have chosen your path. You will stand before them today, little scholar. You will have your audience, and you will watch as everything you hope to build, everyone you care for, is torn apart before your eyes. You have not saved your world. You have simply made its destruction more personal." He did not leave through the door. The shadows in the corner of the room simply swelled, enveloping him, and when they receded, he was gone. The door remained open, swinging gently on its hinges, a silent passageway to the final battle he had just declared. The grand hall of the Veridia summit was a masterpiece of fragile diplomacy, a vast space of polished marble and intricate stained glass, where the air itself seemed to hold its breath. Delegates from every corner of the known world sat in tents, segregated blocks, their colorful silks and polished armor, a vivid map of old alliances and older hatreds. High above, on a balcony overlooking the assembly, the chorus of unity began its opening hymn, a soaring melody meant to symbolize a new beginning. It was in that precise, symbolic moment, as the last pure note hung in the air, that Alara took a deep breath and stepped from the shadows of a pillar into the center of the main aisle. All eyes turned to her, a mixture of curiosity and confusion on the faces of the powerful. She opened her mouth to speak, to unleash the truth that had cost them so much, but the words never had a chance to leave her lips. Malachar's counterstroke was not a clash of steel, but a masterclass in psychological warfare. It began with a single, piercing scream from the back of the hall, a sound of pure, unadulterated terror. Before anyone could identify its source, a section of the ornate ceiling near the Athelian delegation seemed to explode in a shower of plaster dust and acrid black smoke. The chaos was instantaneous and absolute. It was a trigger pulled on the collective, frayed nerves of the entire assembly. Delegates, already primed for betrayal by weeks of subtle provocations, did not see an accident or a bizarre malfunction. They saw an attack. The elven contingent, their legendary grace forgotten in a surge of panic, drew their slender blades, believing the smoke screen was a prelude to an assault. The dwarven ambassadors, mistaking the elven reaction for an act of aggression, raised their heavy shields in a thunderous wall, bellowing for their own guards. The beautiful hall descended into a screaming, shoving, terrified riot in a matter of heartbeats. Elara was instantly swallowed by the panic tide of bodies. Her view of the speaker's platform, her goal, was completely blocked by a surging wall of fleeing dignitaries and advancing guards. She tried to shout, to be heard above the din, but her voice was a whisper in a hurricane. This was Malachar's genius. He didn't need to silence her himself. He had weaponized the fear and suspicion his agents had been carefully cultivating for months. The truth was now drowning in a sea of its intended audience's own panic. Her quest was ending not with a revelation, but in the ignominy of being trampled underfoot by the very people she was trying to save. But she was not alone. As the chaos reached its fever pitch, a pocket of order suddenly formed around her. Kalin materialized at her side, his soldier's instincts taking over completely. He was a rock in the raging river, using his own body and a commandeered ceremonial shield to physically shove and block the wildest surges of the crowd, creating a small, stable space around Alara. The platform, go for the platform, he roared over the cacophony, his voice a beacon of focus. I'll hold this side. From the opposite flank, Finn entered the fray with a different kind of precision. He didn't fight the crowd, he redirected it. Using his knowledge of mob psychology from 100 battlefield routes, he began creating diversions. He overturned a heavy wooden bench with a thunderous crash, drawing the attention and panic of a group of fleeing scribes away from Alara's path. He pointed and shouted, "Assassin, there," in the opposite direction, creating a momentary surge that cleared a few precious feet of space. He was a maestro of misdirection, playing the crowd's own fear against itself to carve a narrow corridor through the madness. High above on a balcony, Lyra saw the entire scene unfold like a living map. She couldn't fight, but she could guide. Using a complex series of hand signals they had developed during their journey, a silent language born of necessity, she began directing Alara from her vantage point. She pointed to a gap opening up between two struggling groups of guards. She signaled a warning as a new pocket of violence erupted to the left. She was Alara's eyes, cutting through the visual noise of the riot and charting the only possible path forward, a winding, treacherous route that led to the base of the speaker's dais. The final yards were the most perilous. The space before the platform was a churning maelstrom of royal guards from a dozen different nations, all shouting contradictory orders and shoving each other in a confused attempt to protect their respective leaders. There was no way through. Seeing this, Kalin and Finn made a simultaneous, unspoken decision. They stopped trying to clear a path and instead began to make one. Locking their shoulders together, they became a human battering ram, driving forward with sheer, desperate force into the thickest part of the melee. They weren't fighting the guards. They were absorbing their blows, creating a wedge of pure momentum that parted the chaotic sea just enough for Alara to slip through in their wake. It was a sacrifice play, a brutal effort that left them exposed and battered, but it was the only way. With one final, lunging step, Alara broke free of the crowd and scrambled up the steps of the speaker's platform, turning to face the roaring chaos of the hall, her evidence clutched tight in her hand, her friends having given her the stage at immense cost. Standing on the speaker's platform, the chaotic roar of the hall washing over her, Elara felt a surreal calm descend. This was the moment. All the miles, the fear, the loss had led to this single, fragile chance. She drew herself up to her full height, the precious scrolls and rubbings held aloft in her hands not as weapons, but as offerings. She did not shout. Instead, she began to speak, her voice not a scream to be heard over the din, but a clear, steady projection that cut through the panic like a blade. She poured every ounce of her conviction, every shred of her hard-won knowledge into her words. She began not with accusations, but with a question that echoed in the sudden pocket of silence around her. "You feel it, don't you?" she called out, her gaze sweeping over the bewildered, angry faces below. The distrust in this room, the certainty that the delegate across from you is acting in bad faith. The feeling that peace is impossible because they cannot be trusted. She gave voice to the very emotions Malachar's agents had been cultivating for months, naming the invisible poison in the air. What if that feeling is not your own? What if it has been carefully planted and nurtured, not by your enemies in this room, but by a power that sees your conflict as its harvest? Then she unveiled the evidence. With Lyra's help from the edge of the platform, she held up the large vellum rubbings from the Eldoria chamber. She pointed to the unmistakable imagery, the glorious Maiar figures, and the wispy, shadowy forms coiled around them, whispering, guiding, manipulating. She described the hidden sanctum, the puzzles, the price paid to bring this truth to light. She held up the Sunfall scroll, translating its cold, precise instructions for sowing discord at this very summit. She connected the ancient symbols to the recent, inexplicable events many delegates had themselves witnessed. The forged letters, the changed security details, the sudden, irrational paranoia in trusted advisors. She was not just telling a story, she was providing a key to a lock that had been tormenting them all. The effect was electric, but it was not unifying. The hall fractured along entirely new lines. A faction of delegates, particularly the younger scholars and those from regions most devastated by the wars, listened with dawning horror and recognition. They saw the logic, the terrifying pattern. A young diplomat from the Northern Reach, whose father had died in the same pointless skirmish Finn had described, stood up, his face pale. "She's right," he shouted, his voice trembling with emotion. "The reports from the front, the contradictory orders, it makes a terrible sense now." Others nodded, a wave of uneasy agreement spreading through one section of the hall. The truth was resonating, finding purchase in hearts weary of unexplained tragedy. But for others, the revelation was not a key, it was an assault. Older, more established delegates from powerful empires saw not a truth teller, but a provocateur. A grizzled general from the Athelian contingent slammed his fist on his desk, his face purple with rage. "Lies, poisonous lies," he boomed. "This is a desperate trick. A fantastical story designed to shatter what little trust remains and make us doubt our own leaders." Another accused her of being an agent of a rival nation, inventing a monstrous fairy tale to discredit them all. They attacked the evidence itself. How convenient that the only proof came from hidden chambers and stolen scrolls that no one else could verify. The division was no longer between old enemies. It was between those willing to consider a terrifying new reality and those who clung to the familiar, even if the familiar was a world perpetually on the brink of war. This was the division the Umbrals feasted on. This was the harvest Malachar had promised. As the delegates turned on each other, their arguments growing more heated and less rational, the shadowy agents embedded within the delegations saw their moment and struck. A guards captain loyal to the Umbral cause shouted that the elven delegates were reaching for concealed weapons, prompting a panicked squad of dwarven guards to raise their crossbows. An advisor whispered into the ear of an already furious general, suggesting that the scholars who believed the story were part of the conspiracy, that they needed to be seized for questioning to uncover the real plot. The hall, which had moments before been a chaotic riot of fear, now transformed into a toxic cauldron of mutual suspicion and escalating accusations. The Umbrals did not need to attack. They simply poured fuel on the fires of discord that Alara's truth had ignited, proving her right even as her opponents used that very chaos to condemn her. The light of revelation had not brought unity. It had exposed the deepest fractures, and the shadows were rushing in to widen them into an abyss. The fragile truce of shouted arguments and accusations shattered in an instant. The air in the grand hall grew deathly cold, and the very light seemed to dim, as if the sun outside had been abruptly extinguished. From the deepest shadows between the marble pillars, from beneath the ornate benches where the delegates cowered, the darkness itself began to writhe and coalesce. It was Malachar. He stood at the center of the hall, no longer the charming manipulator or the disappointed patron. His form seemed to swell, the elegant gray robes melting away into a swirling vortex of absolute blackness. 2 points of cold, star-like light ignited where his eyes had been, and his voice, when he spoke, was no longer a single sound, but a chorus of whispers that scraped against the mind. You sought to bring light into the dark places, little scholar, the voices hissed, a sound that came from everywhere and nowhere at once. Now you will drown in it. With a gesture that was more a convulsion of reality than a movement of a limb, he tore a rift in the air beside him. It was a wound in the world, dripping a darkness so profound it hurt to look at. And from that tear they came. They were not creatures of flesh and bone, but of solidified shadow and nightmare. Some skittered across the high ceilings like malformed insects, their many-jointed limbs scraping against the stone. Others flowed across the floor like living oil, their forms shifting and dissolving only to reform closer to their prey. They had no distinct features, only a terrifying hunger made manifest, and they fell upon the nearest delegates with a silent, chilling purpose. The political divisions of moments before vanished, replaced by the universal language of pure, primal terror. The hall became a charnel house of confusion and screams. The mission was no longer about persuasion. It was pure, desperate triage. Alara's heart hammered against her ribs, her scholarly mind reeling at the sheer, impossible reality of the horror she was witnessing. But there was no time for awe or fear. Protect the delegates, she screamed, her voice finding a strength she didn't know she possessed, cutting through the panic. Get them to the sides, form a perimeter. They had no coordinated army, only a handful of heroes against a tide of shadow. Kalin was already in motion, a force of nature unleashed. He snatched up a fallen guard's pike, its steel head seeming to gleam with a faint, defiant light against the encroaching dark. He didn't try to kill the creatures. Their forms were too fluid, too insubstantial for conventional weapons. Instead, he became a whirlwind of deflection and disruption, using the pike's length to shove the shadows back, to knock them off course, to create pockets of safety for the fleeing dignitaries. He was a bulwark, a mobile fortress, his every move a calculated risk to draw the attention of the largest threats away from the most vulnerable. Finn fought with the grim efficiency of a soldier who had long since accepted the insanity of war. He had grabbed a heavy oak chair, smashing it against the floor to create two makeshift clubs. He fought not like a warrior on a battlefield, but like a brawler in a barroom, using short, brutal swings to batter the shadowy forms, his aim not to destroy them, but to disrupt their cohesion. He fought in tandem with the few guards who had kept their wits, coordinating with grunts and hand signals, creating a shaky defensive line that slowly began to shepherd a group of terrified delegates toward a fortified antechamber. His pragmatism was their anchor. He focused on the immediate goal, survival 1 inch of ground at a time. Lyra, weaponless and terrified, found her battlefield was information. From her vantage point, her archivist's mind began to work at a frantic pace, cutting through the chaos to identify patterns. She saw that the creatures seemed to weaken momentarily when they passed through a patch of bright light cast by a fallen, still burning ceremonial brazier. Light, they disliked the light, she shouted to Alara. She also noticed that Malachar himself remained at the center of the storm, his hands moving in complex patterns, and that with each gesture, a new wave of shadows would spill from the rift. He's sustaining them, he's the source. Her voice, though filled with terror, was sharp and clear, providing the crucial intelligence they needed to fight smarter, not just harder. Alara took in Lyra's shouts, the pieces snapping together in her mind. They couldn't win this battle by fighting an endless army. They had to stop the general. Her eyes locked on Malachar, who stood wreathed in power, a look of cold amusement on his features as he watched them struggle. Neutralizing him was the only way. But to reach him, she would have to cross a floor teeming with his creations, a journey that seemed utterly impossible. She saw Kalin, holding back 3 larger shadows that were trying to flank a group of cowering scholars. She saw Finn, bleeding from a cut on his arm where a shadowy claw had grazed him, his movements starting to slow. Every choice in that chaotic maelstrom had a cost. Do she try for Malachar and leave her friends to be overwhelmed? Or does she join the defense and allow the Umbral master to summon ever greater horrors unchallenged? It was a brutal calculus where every second of hesitation meant more lives lost, and the weight of every decision pressed down on her, threatening to paralyze her completely. The battle for the sum, it was no longer about evidence or speeches. It was a test of will, fought in the space between a shadow's whisper and a friend's cry of pain. The chaos of the battle reached a terrible crescendo, a symphony of screams and the chilling whispers of the shadow creatures. Elara, her voice growing hoarse from shouting warnings and encouragement, was desperately trying to reach Malachar, using the brief flashes of light from overturned braziers to keep the swarming shadows at bay. She was so focused on her goal, on the Umbral master who stood calmly at the heart of the storm, that she never saw the larger horror detach itself from the high ceiling above her. It was a mass of concentrated darkness, a spear of pure malice that dropped silently, aiming directly for her heart. Kalin saw it from across the hall, where he was using his body and a broken spear haft to shield a group of terrified delegates. His eyes met the descending threat. There was no time for a shouted warning, no time for a strategic maneuver. There was only instinct, a final, decisive act forged in the fires of their shared journey. The cynical historian, who had once prized his own safety above all else, did not hesitate. With a raw, wordless cry that was part effort and part farewell, he threw himself forward, shoving Alara out of the path of the killing blow with all the strength he had left. The impact was not loud, but it was final. The shadow spear meant for Alara took Kalin full in the chest. There was no blood, no visible wound, but a wave of absolute cold radiated from the point of impact, and the light in Kalin's eyes, the light of newfound purpose and hard-won courage, was instantly extinguished. He crumpled to the polished marble floor, his body already growing pale and still, a stark island of silence in the roaring tumult. For Elara, the world seemed to slow to a crawl. The sounds of the battle faded into a distant hum. Her breath caught in her throat, and her heart felt as though it had been pierced alongside his. The sight of her friend, her protector, her brother in arms, lying lifeless on the ground because of her quest, was a pain more acute than any physical wound. A wave of paralyzing grief threatened to consume her entirely, to drop her to her knees beside him in surrender. But then, rising from the depths of that grief, came something else, a cold, pure, and absolute fury. It was not a hot, blinding rage, but a focused, diamond-hard resolve. Kalin's sacrifice was not an end. It was a transfer of will. He had given her the one thing she needed most in that impossible moment. Not just an opening, but a reason to use it. His death was a silent command, a final act of faith, that she would finish what they had started together. The sorrow was still there, a vast and aching hollow in her chest, but it was now filled with a purpose so fierce, it burned away all fear, all doubt. Malachar, witnessing the sacrifice from his central position, merely smiled, a cold twist of his lips that suggested he found the gesture both predictable and pathetic. He began to raise his hands again, ready to summon another wave of shadows to finally crush her, but Alara was already moving. She did not charge at him with a weapon. She advanced with the authority of a scholar who had finally deciphered the most important text of all. As she walked, she reached into the satchel at her hip, her fingers not fumbling in panic, but moving with a deliberate, practiced certainty. She pulled forth the oldest, most fragile scroll from Sunfall, the one Lyra had identified as containing the words of unmaking. She began to speak, but her voice was no longer her own. It was lower, resonant, layered with echoes of the ancient language she was speaking. The words were not shouted, they were intoned, each syllable a weighty thing that seemed to vibrate in the air itself, causing the very stone beneath their feet to hum in response. They were not words of destruction or banishment, but words of severance, of naming a thing truly, and thus breaking its power to deceive. She spoke of the Umbrals not as powerful gods, but as parasites, as refugees from a forgotten realm who had no true form of their own, who could only exist by clinging to the fears and conflicts of others. The effect on Malachar was immediate and visceral. His smug confidence shattered. The swirling darkness that composed his form flickered and writhed as if in agony. The cold, star-like points of his eyes widened in shock and then in genuine pain. The connection he held open to the Umbral realm, the rift that poured endless shadows into the hall, began to waver and fray. The ancient words were a key turning in a lock that had been closed for millennia, and they were breaking his hold on the source of his power. He staggered, clutching at his head, a raw, furious scream tearing from his throat, a scream of pure frustration that held none of its former calculated menace. The gardener was suddenly finding his own tools turned against him, and for the first time, the Master of Shadows looked frighteningly, vulnerably mortal. While Elara's confrontation with Malachar became the focal point of the storm, the battle for survival raged across the rest of the Grand Hall. The initial, panicked scramble of delegates had devolved into a nightmare of trapped and cornered figures, many of whom were dignitaries and scholars, not warriors, utterly unprepared for the shadowy horrors closing in. In this chaos, an unlikely but formidable partnership snapped into place. Lyra and Finn, separated from Alara and Kalin by the surging tide of combat, found themselves back to back, their skill sets a perfect, complementary match for the crisis. Where Finn saw tactics and immediate threats, Lyra saw patterns and hidden weaknesses. He was the strength, she was the sight. Finn's military instincts took immediate command of the situation. His voice, trained to carry over the din of a battlefield, cut through the supernatural terror. To the side chamber, now, the doorway is narrow, we can bottle them up. He wasn't just shouting orders, he was creating a plan on the fly, identifying the most defensible position in the crumbling hall. He moved with a brutal, efficient grace, not trying to destroy the shifting shadows, a near impossible task, but using his confiscated sword and a heavy oaken shield to batter them aside, to create a temporary corridor through the darkness. He was a force of pure momentum, a human plow, clearing a path through a field of nightmares. Lyra's role was no less critical. While Finn provided the muscle, she became the mind of the operation. Her eyes, accustomed to scanning ancient texts for minute details and discrepancies, now scanned the chaotic battlefield. She didn't see a meaningless swirl of darkness. She saw a horrifyingly intelligent pattern. Finn, left, there flanking from the left behind the overturned table. She'd shout, her voice sharp with urgency. She noticed that the creatures seemed to coalesce more solidly in the deepest shadows, becoming more vulnerable to a solid blow the moment they passed through a patch of flickering torchlight. There, weaker in the light, pushed them toward the braziers. Her knowledge, once confined to dusty scrolls, was now a real-time tactical manual for fighting a myth made real. Their evacuation effort was a masterpiece of improvised teamwork. Finn would identify a pocket of trapped delegates and begin carving a path toward them, a whirlwind of controlled violence. Lyra would then dart into the space he created, her demeanor shifting from analyst to calming authority. This way, quickly, but don't run. Hold on to the person in front of you. She guided the terrified nobles and advisors with a surprising firmness, herding them like a shepherd through a wolf-filled forest toward the relative safety of the antechamber Finn had secured. At one point, a particularly large shadow creature, a thing of grasping tendrils and a gaping maw of nothingness, lunged from a high balcony directly at a group of fleeing delegates. Finn, seeing the threat, roared a challenge, but was too far away to intercept. Thinking fast, Lyra grabbed a heavy, metal-bound ledger from a discarded scribe's desk and hurled it with all her might not at the creature, but at a large, polished ceremonial gong hanging nearby. The deafening clang that erupted was so shockingly loud and out of place that the creature recoiled for a split second, its attack disrupted. That single second was all Finn needed to close the distance and bodily tackle the horror away from the civilians, driving it back with a series of powerful, two-handed swings of his blade. This was the heart of their victory, not in killing every monster, but in saving every life they could. Each delegate they shoved through that narrow doorway was a life preserved, a story that would continue, a voice that could one day bear witness. Their actions were a living refutation of the Umbral philosophy. The shadows sought to divide and isolate, to turn individuals into panicked, solitary prey. Lyra and Finn, through their combined and utterly different strengths, were doing the exact opposite. They were forging a united front from the scattered remnants of the summit, creating order from chaos, and proving that cooperation and trust could form a shield even against the most overwhelming and manipulative odds. They were holding the line, not just physically, but ideologically, becoming a beacon of what was possible when knowledge and courage worked in concert. The resonant hum of the ancient words still hung in the air, a tangible force that made the very stones of the hall vibrate. Malachar, the master of shadows, was no longer a figure of terrifying power, but a being in visible distress. The swirling darkness that composed his form flickered and writhed like a guttering candle flame, and the cold, star-like points of his eyes were wide with a pain that was entirely new to him. Elara stood before him, not with a weapon raised, but with the open scroll held in her steady hands, her voice the anchor in the storm she had unleashed. The physical battle around them seemed to fade into a distant backdrop. This was now a conflict of ideologies, a duel for the very soul of reality itself. "You feel it, don't you?" Elara's voice was calm, yet it carried an immense weight, each word a deliberate strike against his crumbling facade, the severing. The words are not a weapon, they are a mirror. They show you what you truly are, not a god, not a master, a refugee, a being so devoid of purpose, it must leech the passion and pain of others to feel anything at all. She took a step closer, and the darkness around him recoiled. All this time, you have spoken of bringing order from chaos, of being a gardener who prunes. But you are the most chaotic force of all. You are a void that can only take, never create. You feed on the stories of others because you have no story of your own. Malachar let out a rasping hiss, a sound of pure frustration that was utterly devoid of its former calculated menace. You understand nothing, this existence you champion, this chaotic, screaming struggle of fleeting lives. It is meaningless. We offer eternity. We offer a purpose that transcends your petty mortal concerns. But his words rang hollow, the grand pronouncements of a philosophy, now being exposed at its rotten core. It is not eternity you offer, Elara countered, her gaze never wavering. It is stasis. It is a silent, cold museum where you are the only patron. You speak of purpose, but your only purpose is consumption. You are not afraid of our chaos, Malachar. You are afraid of our light. You are afraid of our ability to hope, to love, to rebuild, to create meaning for ourselves, even in the face of suffering. That is a power you will never have, and so you must extinguish it wherever you find it. For a fleeting moment, a crack appeared in the Umbral master's armor of arrogance. In the depths of his flickering eyes, Alara did not see anger, but a profound and ancient loneliness, a yawning emptiness so vast it could never be filled. It was the fear of a creature confronted with the one thing it could not manipulate or consume, genuine, unconditional compassion. Seeing that flicker of vulnerability, Alara made her offer. It was not a negotiation, but an act of supreme empathy. You can still choose, she said, her voice softening. The connection can be severed cleanly. You can step away from this. You do not have to be defined by this hunger. There can be an end to the isolation. The moment stretched, thin, and fragile. The hall held its breath. Then, the moment shattered. The vulnerability in Malachar's eyes was snuffed out, replaced by a fury so absolute it was terrifying. The offer of redemption was to him the ultimate insult. To renounce his path would be to admit that the countless ages of manipulation, the wars harvested, the lives ruined, had all been for nothing. His pride was the final chain that bound him to his damnation. Never, he snarled, the word a vortex of hatred. I would rather unravel the fabric of this world than bow to a speck of dust like you. With a final, desperate surge of will, he gathered the remnants of his power, not to fight, but to unleash one last, cataclysmic wave of pure negation, aimed not at Alara, but at the weakened rift itself, to tear it open forever. There was no more time for words. Alara's heart ached with the tragic waste of it all, but her resolve was absolute. She raised the scroll high, its ancient parchment glowing with a fierce white light. She spoke the final phrase, the word of unmaking, the syllable that meant enough. The energy that left her was not merely magical. It felt like a piece of her own life force, her own hope, her own memory of Kalin's smile. It drained from her in a rushing torrent, leaving her dizzy and weak, her knees buckling beneath her. The word struck Malachar not as a blast, but as a quiet, absolute command. His form didn't explode, it unraveled. The darkness composing him dissipated like smoke in a strong wind, and the piercing points of his eyes dimmed and vanished into nothingness. The rift in the air sealed with a sound like a sigh, leaving behind only the clear, undisturbed space of the hall. The shadow creatures, their source of power severed, dissolved into wisps of harmless mist that evaporated under the light of the remaining braziers. Malachar was gone, banished. The silence that followed was deafening, broken only by Elara's ragged gasps as she collapsed to the floor, the weight of her victory and her loss crashing down upon her all at once. The deafening silence that followed the dissipation of the Umbral horrors was almost more unsettling than the chaos itself. The grand hall was a wreckage of overturned benches, scattered scrolls, and the lingering, acrid scent of ozone and fear. But the true damage was written on the faces of the delegates. The arrogance and suspicion that had marked the summit's beginning were gone, replaced by a shell-shocked vulnerability, a collective trauma that left them silent and trembling. They had not just been attacked, their very perceptions of reality had been weaponized against them. Into this fragile, wounded space, Alara moved, though every muscle in her body screamed with a deep, soul-weary exhaustion, and the phantom ache of Kalin's loss was a fresh wound in her heart. She knew this moment was as critical as the battle itself. The shadows were banished, but the seeds of discord they had planted still remained in the soil of memory and fear. If left untended, those seeds would sprout anew. She did not stand on the speaker's platform to command or declare victory. Instead, she walked slowly among them, her steps careful amidst the debris. She helped an elderly dwarven delegate to his feet, her touch gentle on his arm. She retrieved a pair of spectacles for an elven scribe, her hands steady despite their faint tremor. These were not grand gestures, but they were a language everyone present could understand, a language of basic human decency, cutting through the aftermath of inhuman terror. When she finally spoke, her voice was hoarse from chanting the ancient words, but it carried a quiet, undeniable authority born of shared experience. They preyed on our divisions, she said, her gaze sweeping over the assembled leaders, making eye contact with those who had called her a liar moments before. They turned our own doubts, our own history, into weapons. The greatest defense we can possibly build now is not a higher wall or a sharper sword. It is trust. But it must be a clear-eyed trust, a vigilant trust. This became the foundation of the initial, halting talks that began right there on the scarred floor of the summit hall. Elara, with Lyra and Finn flanking her like weary sentinels, did not act as a ruler, but as a facilitator, a translator of this terrifying new reality into practical terms. She guided the conversation away from the impossible, hunting every last Umbral remnant, and toward the achievable. We must create new channels, she suggested, her tone pragmatic yet hopeful. Not just for trade or military agreements, but for information, a single courier network that all nations share, so a forged letter can be spotted and confirmed within hours, not weeks. A council of historians and scholars, free from political influence, dedicated to identifying these patterns of manipulation in our past and present. Lyra, with her archivist's precision, immediately began outlining the logistics, while Finn, drawing on his military experience, proposed protocols for vetting security personnel across national lines to look for the specific signs of psychological coercion he had witnessed. The inspiration that flowed from Alara's actions was not one of blind hero worship, but of empowered collaboration. The young diplomat from the Northern Reach, who had first spoken up, now volunteered his nation's extensive spy network to serve the new information-sharing initiative. The grizzled Athelian general, who had denounced her, humbled by the evidence of his own nearly manipulated guards, offered his strategic expertise to design the new security protocols. They were no longer delegates representing isolated interests. They were survivors of a common attack, building a mutual defense system for the soul of their civilizations. It was the birth of a new kind of cooperation, one forged not in the easy times of peace, but in the hard one, understanding that some enemies could only be defeated by holding on to each other, by choosing to believe in a shared future, even when the shadows of the past whispered otherwise. The work was just beginning, and the road ahead was long and uncertain, but in that battered hall, illuminated by the rising sun, filtering through broken stained glass, the first fragile threads of a new era were being woven. The grand ceremony held in their honor felt like a world away from the dusty library ruins where it had all begun, under the bright banners of a dozen reconciled nations, surrounded by the applause of delegates whose lives they had saved. Elara, Lyra, and Finn stood as heroes. Medals were bestowed, titles were offered, and speeches were made praising their courage and the new era of cooperation they had inspired. Yet, for the three of them, the shining accolades felt hollow, the celebratory music a stark contrast to the quiet, aching absence that walked beside them. The victory had come at a cost that no medal could ever repay. They accepted the honors with solemn grace, not for themselves, but for the memory of the man who had made the final, ultimate payment. Every handshake, every word of gratitude was a silent reminder of the friend who should have been standing there with them. His cynical smirk perhaps finally softened into a genuine, hard-won smile. In the quiet days that followed, as the business of building a new world began in earnest, the three found themselves drawn together not by duty, but by a shared need to make sense of their loss. They gathered in a small, sunlit room in Veridia, away from the politics and the praise, and they spoke of Kalin. They shared stories Alara of his reluctant, brilliant mind, first opening to the possibility of truth, Lyra of his strength in the mountain passes and the temple depths, Finn of the shared, unspoken language of soldiers that had passed between them in the heat of battle. It was in this space of shared grief and remembrance that the idea was born, not as a grand plan, but as a quiet promise. They would not let his sacrifice be a singular, tragic event that faded into history. They would build something lasting, something that would embody the very qualities he had discovered in himself at the end: courage, commitment, and the protection of knowledge. And so, the Sentinels of the Unwritten Page was founded. It was not an army, nor a guild of scholars in the traditional sense. It was something entirely new, a fusion of all their unique strengths into a single, dedicated purpose. Its core mission was twofold, a direct response to the lessons they had learned the hard way. First, to actively seek out and preserve forbidden or suppressed knowledge, creating a true, uncensored record of history that could never be erased by entities like the Keepers of the Vale. They would not lock this knowledge away. They would study it, understand it, and use it to recognize the patterns of manipulation. Second, and just as crucially, to watch. To maintain a vigilant, discreet network of observers across all levels of society. Archivists, soldiers, diplomats, merchants trained to spot the subtle signs of umbral influence. The sudden, irrational shift in a leader's behavior. The perfectly timed rumor that sows discord. The inexplicable failure of a long-standing alliance. They would be the early warning system the world had so desperately lacked. The headquarters for this new order was a deliberate choice. They did not build a fortress in a capital city or a remote tower. They returned to the one place that felt right, the place where a different future had become possible. They established their base in the reclaimed and reconsecrated temple of the First Dawn in Eldoria, its hidden sanctum, now the heart of their archives. The puzzles that had once guarded a secret now served as a training ground for new recruits, teaching them the value of patience, perception, and diverse thinking. Lyra took charge of the vast library, developing ciphers and cataloging systems more secure than any that had come before. Finn, drawing from his own painful experience, designed the training protocols for their field agents, teaching them how to spot psychological manipulation and maintain their own mental clarity under pressure. And Alara, though her heart was still heavy, became the guiding voice, the keeper of their purpose, ensuring that their mission always remained one of enlightenment and protection, never descending into paranoia or control. They built this new order not for glory, but as a living memorial, a promise etched not in stone, but in action, ensuring that Kalin's death would forever be a shield for the living. The polished marble halls and political accolades of Veridia felt a world away as Alara stood once more amidst the quiet, dust-moted air of a library. But this was not a return to what was. It was the beginning of what would be. Her personal study, now housed within the newly founded Sentinels' headquarters in Eldoria, was a place of organized chaos, a testament to her renewed purpose. Stacked on her desk were not just the precious scrolls from Sunfall and the rubbings from the hidden sanctum, but piles of fresh parchment, pots of ink, and a collection of pens worn down by relentless use. Her quest was no longer one of discovery, but of creation. She was determined to write the true history of the Maiar and the Umbrals, to take the evidence they had almost died for and weave it into a coherent, unassailable narrative that would stand for generations. This would be the foundational text for the Sentinels, the definitive account that replaced myth with documented truth, ensuring that the sacrifice of her friend was immortalized not just in memory, but in fact. This monumental task was far more than an academic exercise. It was an act of profound responsibility. Every word she penned was measured against the immense weight of what she now knew. She wrote of the Maiar not as flawless, godlike figures, but as immensely powerful beings who were tragically susceptible to the same whispers of pride, fear, and ambition that touch all conscious beings. She detailed the insidious methods of the Umbrals with the precision of a strategist dissecting an enemy's campaign, explaining how they did not create conflict, but expertly amplified the discord that already existed, turning minor disagreements into catastrophic wars. Her history was clear-eyed and unsentimental, refusing to vilify or deify, aiming instead for a stark, honest clarity that would serve as the ultimate weapon against deception. She understood that a sanitized, heroic myth would be just as vulnerable to manipulation as a complete lie. Only the unvarnished, complex truth could provide a sturdy enough foundation to build upon. This understanding naturally extended to her new role as a mentor. The Sentinels of the Unwritten Page attracted a unique kind of individual, not just scholars, but former soldiers like Finn, curious artisans, and even once skeptical bureaucrats, all united by a shared desire to protect the world they had almost lost. Elara took a personal hand in guiding the newest recruits, and her lessons went far beyond deciphering ancient scripts or identifying umbral sigils. She taught them the lessons written in blood and courage that she and her friends had learned on their journey. She spoke of the cost of truth, of the weight of knowing something that could shatter the world if revealed carelessly. She taught them that courage was not the absence of fear, but the determination to act rightly in spite of it, just as Kalin had on the mountain passes and in the summit hall. She encouraged them to question not only the sources they studied, but also their own assumptions, to cultivate a mindset of vigilant curiosity that was immune to the seductive simplicity of absolute answers. In these moments, guiding the next generation, she found a deep and unexpected solace. The haunting grief for Kalin never truly left her. It was a permanent chamber within her heart. But it was no longer a void of pure sorrow. It had become a wellspring of purpose. Every time she saw a young scholar's eyes light up with understanding, or watched a recruit successfully navigate a complex ethical dilemma about when to share dangerous knowledge, she felt the echo of his sacrifice, giving life to something new and strong. She realized that awareness was not a passive state of knowing. It was an active, living defense. It was the light that she and her friends had lit in the darkness, and now her purpose was to teach others how to tend their own flames, to create a constellation of awareness so bright that the shadows would have nowhere left to hide. The war was not over. The whispers of Umbral remnants were a constant reminder, but they were no longer fighting it in the dark. They were armed with the past, and they were training the future, and in that continuous thread of vigilance, Alara found a peace that was stronger than any fear. The grand library within the Temple of the First Dawn was no longer a silent tomb of forgotten knowledge, but the vibrant, beating heart of a new kind of defense. Here, amidst the scent of old parchment and ink, Lyra and Finn found their purpose fully realized, their unique skills now the twin pillars of the Sentinels of the Unwritten Page. They were no longer merely survivors of a harrowing quest. They were architects of a global early warning system, building something lasting from the ashes of their shared trauma. Lyra's domain was the intricate web of information, a network that stretched far beyond the stone walls of Eldoria. Using the ancient trade routes and scholarly correspondence channels she had mastered as an archivist, she began weaving a delicate tapestry of informants. These weren't traditional spies, but a diverse array of eyes and ears she carefully cultivated. A master brewer in a bustling port city who heard the unguarded talk of sailors from every nation. A quiet monastic scribe who noticed subtle changes in the phrasing of official decrees. A traveling minstrel who collected rumors like others collected coins. Lyra taught them not what to look for, but how to see. She developed a series of seemingly innocuous symbols, a specific fold in a letter, a particular arrangement of flowers in a market stall, a coded phrase in a popular song that could be used to report anomalies, a mayor acting strangely out of character, a sudden spike in trade disputes, a local legend being twisted to sow discord. Her genius was in creating a system that was invisible to anyone who didn't know how to look. A silent conversation happening in the open, ensuring that the first whisper of Umbral influence would not go unheard. Finn's role was the necessary counterpart to Lyra's subtle web. If she was the mind of the operation, he was its strong right arm, tasked with building and training the protectors. These were the men and women who would act on the intelligence Lyra's network provided, drawing from his own brutal experience with psychological manipulation on the battlefield. Finn was uniquely qualified for this task. He didn't recruit for brute strength or blind loyalty. He sought out individuals with a keen sense of intuition, those who could feel the shift in the wind before the storm hit. His training grounds were not just for sparring and combat drills, though those were essential. He ran complex exercises designed to simulate the Umbrals' preferred tactics. He would have his trainees navigate a room full of actors planted to spread contradictory rumors, forcing them to identify the source of the discord. He taught them to recognize the glassy-eyed look of a person whose fears were being amplified, to de-escalate tensions rather than inflame them, to be a calming presence in the eye of a manufactured storm. A protector's greatest weapon, Finn preached, was not a sword, but unwavering clarity of thought and the ability to keep others from succumbing to panic. He built a force that could stand firm against an enemy that fought with whispers and nightmares, a shield for the communities they were sworn to protect. In the quiet evenings, after the day's reports had been filed and the training yards had fallen silent, the two of them would often find themselves on a small balcony overlooking the city, a place that had become their own private sanctuary. It was here, sharing a simple meal, that the memories would surface. They weren't the grand, epic tales told to new recruits around the fire, but the small, human moments that had forged their unbreakable bond. Finn might chuckle, recalling the absolute terror on Lyra's face when she'd had to swing across that gap in the Sunfall Zigorate, and how she'd immediately afterward, with trembling hands, checked to make sure the scroll was still secure in her robe. Lyra would smile, reminding him of the time he tried to use his military jargon to describe the taste of a rare desert fruit, failing so miserably that even a stone-faced Kalin had cracked a smile. They spoke of Alara's fierce determination, of Kalin's sacrifice, not with the heavy weight of grief, but with a profound and sustaining gratitude for having fought alongside them. These conversations were not mere reminiscence, they were a vital ritual. In recounting their journey, they were reminding each other of why they did this difficult, often terrifying work. They were drawing strength from the memory of their shared purpose, reinforcing the bond that had been tempered in fire and shadow. That bond was the bedrock of the entire Sentinel Order, the living proof that trust and cooperation were the most powerful weapons against the darkness they faced. The hard-won peace that settled over the realms was a fragile, precious thing, like the first thin layer of ice on a winter pond. It held, but everyone knew it could shatter with a single misstep. The treaties signed in Veridia were not documents of blind trust, but of clear-eyed, mutually assured vigilance. For the first time in living memory, nations that had once viewed each other across battlefields now maintained open lines of communication, specifically designed to counter the Umbral threat. Courier networks merged, allowing messages between capitals to be cross-referenced for authenticity in a matter of hours instead of weeks. Military attachés once solely spies, now shared intelligence on strange troop movements or unexplained shifts in command structure. The very hallmarks of the shadowy manipulation they had all endured. It was a peace built not on the naive hope that the darkness was gone, but on the shared, sober understanding of what the darkness could do. People walked in the sunlight again, but they had learned to appreciate the light precisely because they knew how long the shadows could be. Yet, for all the progress, a chill always lingered at the edge of the warmth. The work of the sentinels of the unwritten page ensured that the world was never lulled into a false sense of security. Reports filtered into Eldoria from Lyra's vast network, each one a tiny, often ambiguous piece of a puzzle that might never be fully solved. A respected town mayor in a remote province, known for his fairness, suddenly and inexplicably evicts an entire family of skilled weavers, sparking a bitter ethnic feud that had lain dormant for generations. The official reason is a property dispute, but the timing and the result, a community now riven with suspicion, fit the old patterns perfectly. A promising trade agreement between two coastal cities collapses at the last minute due to a leaked, forged letter that implies one party's deep-seated contempt for the other's customs. The letter is quickly exposed as a fake by the shared messenger service, but the damage is done, the trust is broken, and the deal falls apart. These events were never accompanied by the overt, terrifying spectacle of shadow creatures. They were quieter, subtler, and therefore more insidious. They were the work of remnants, of fragments of the Umbral influence that had escaped the final unmaking, or perhaps of entirely new entities learning the same ancient, cruel tricks. This constant, low-grade threat transformed the nature of peace itself. It was no longer a destination to be reached, but a continuous process to be maintained, a garden that required daily weeding. Vigilance became a civic duty, woven into the fabric of daily life. Parents taught their children not to blindly believe rumors about their neighbors. Town criers would often end their announcements with a gentle reminder to consider the source of shocking news. The greatest legacy of Alara's revelation was this cultural shift, a populace that was becoming increasingly literate in the language of manipulation. They were learning to identify the emotional hooks of a story designed to make them angry or fearful, to question why a particular piece of information was being pushed at a specific time. This wasn't about fostering paranoia, but about promoting a healthy, discerning skepticism. The goal was to make the emotional soil of society less fertile for the seeds of discord, to ensure that when a whisper tried to take root, it would fall on ground that was too rocky and well-tended to support its growth. The understanding that some shadows might never fully disappear was a heavy truth to bear, but it was also a unifying one. It meant that the work of the sentinels was never done, and that every individual had a role to play. The eternal nature of the vigilance required an eternal commitment to the opposite values, to transparency over secrecy, to compassion over suspicion, and to connection over isolation. The peace was tentative, and it likely always would be, but it was defended now by something far stronger than walls or weapons. It was guarded by a world that had stared into the abyss, and instead of turning away in fear, had learned to keep a watchful eye on it forever. The path to the small, quiet cemetery on the outskirts of Eldoria was one Alara knew by heart, yet each visit felt like the first. The air was always still here, filled with the scent of damp earth and the gentle rustle of leaves from the ancient oak that stood sentinel over the plot. She stopped before a simple headstone, its surface worn smooth by weather and time, etched with a name and 2 dates that encompassed a lifetime of transformation: Kalin. She laid a single white desert flower, a rare bloom that thrived in the harshest conditions, at its base, a silent tribute she brought whenever she returned. Standing there, the silence was not empty but full of memory. Her mind drifted back through the incredible tapestry of their journey, from the moment she'd unrolled that fateful scroll in a dusty ruin to the final, cataclysmic confrontation in the summit hall. She saw it all not as a heroic epic, but as a series of fragile, human moments that had irrevocably altered the course of her life and the shape of the world. The scholar who had once sought only answers in old books had been forged in fire, becoming a guardian, a leader, and a keeper of a terrible, wonderful truth. The change in her was profound. Where there had once been only the pursuit of knowledge, there was now a deep understanding of its cost and its responsibility. She carried the weight of that knowledge every day, not as a burden, but as a solemn duty. Her reflection was not a parade of victories, but an honest accounting of cost. The feeling of pride was there, a quiet, steady warmth in her chest, when she thought of the sentinels now thriving in the temple, of the new treaties, of the children in Veridia, who now played in a peace their parents had fought for. But intertwined with that pride was a sorrow so deep, it felt like a physical ache, a permanent hollow space within her that had been carved out by Kalin's absence. She missed his cynical humor that had slowly warmed into dry wit, his stubbornness that had become unwavering loyalty, his steady presence that had been their anchor in the storm. The victory would always be bittersweet, its brightest light forever casting the long shadow of his sacrifice. This was the true, unvarnished truth of their quest, that great change is never free, and its price is often paid by the best among us. Yet, as her fingers traced the cool, smooth stone of his gravestone, the overwhelming emotion that rose to meet the grief was not despair, but a resilient, defiant hope. Kalin had not died for a world doomed to repeat its cycles of darkness. He had died to give that world a fighting chance, to arm it with the one weapon that could truly protect it: awareness. The light of truth was not a blazing sun that banished all shadows forever. Such a thing was a fairy tale. It was more like the lantern she had carried into the underground sanctum, a fragile, flickering flame that required constant care and courage to hold aloft. It illuminated only a small circle at a time, revealing the path immediately ahead and the dangers lurking just beyond its edge. Its power was not in eliminating the darkness, but in allowing you to navigate through it without fear, to see the obstacles for what they were, and choose your steps with care. She knew the work was never done. The whispers of Umbral remnants in distant provinces, the strange, isolated incidents of discord that still flared up, these were reminders that the darkness was patient and eternal. But they were no longer fighting it in ignorance. They were no longer its prey. The world had awakened, and in that awakening lay its greatest defense. Elara took a final, steadying breath, the cool cemetery air filling her lungs with a sense of calm resolve. She looked from the grave to the city of Eldoria, glowing in the distance, a beacon of the fragile civilization they had all fought to protect. She felt a profound sense of peace, knowing that the most important battles are not won with a single, glorious clash, but are fought and won anew every single day, in the choices of ordinary people to seek truth over comfort, courage over fear, and connection over division. The light they had lit was small, but it was held in countless hands now, and as long as it was passed on, the shadows would never, ever win. Years had a way of softening the sharpest edges of memory, turning the frantic terror of their quest into the polished lessons of history. But for Alara, the passage of time only deepened the significance of their hard-won victory. The simple, handwritten pages she had first scratched out in a quiet room in Eldoria, her fingers still trembling from the ordeal, had been meticulously copied, bound in leather, and translated into a dozen languages. They were no longer just her personal account. They were the foundational texts of a new understanding, studied by scholars and soldiers alike in halls of learning across the reconciled realms. Her work on the nature of shadows and the clarity of light was not a chronicle of glorious battles, but a sober, meticulous dissection of manipulation, a field guide to recognizing the subtle erosion of trust, a manual for safeguarding the mind itself. To see her words, born from such personal loss and desperate hope, now discussed in academic debates and taught to wide-eyed students, was a surreal and humbling reality. She had set out to uncover a forgotten truth, and in doing so, she had given the world a new lens through which to view its entire past and its precarious present. The order they had founded, the Sentinels of the Unwritten Page, had grown from a fragile promise made in grief into a robust and respected institution. Its headquarters in the Temple of the First Dawn buzzed with a purposeful energy that was a world away from the silent, watchful fear of the old archives. Where once there had been hidden doors and deadly puzzles, there were now open classrooms and bustling scriptoriums. Lyra's network of informants had evolved into a sophisticated web of communication that spanned continents, while Finn's protectors were a constant, reassuring presence in cities and towns, trained to calm tensions as deftly as they could confront a physical threat. Elara often walked those halls, a quiet, observing presence, and her greatest joy was found not in the grand achievements, but in the small, everyday moments. She loved to pause by a doorway and listen to a seasoned sentinel, perhaps a former merchant or a retired guardsman, patiently explaining to a new recruit how to cross-reference a rumor from a northern port with trade ledgers from the south, teaching them to see the patterns she herself had once struggled to decipher. This was the true fruit of their labor, not a world purged of all darkness, but a world that had learned to see in the dark. On this particular afternoon, the air in the main courtyard was crisp and clear, carrying the sound of earnest young voices. A new class of initiates was taking their oath, their hands resting on copies of the very texts Alara had written. She watched from a shaded archway, her heart swelling with a complex mix of emotions. She saw her own youthful determination reflected in their bright, serious eyes, that same burning need to make a difference. But she also saw something she herself had lacked at their age, a framework. They were not setting out into a void of ignorance. They were stepping into a legacy, armed with tools and knowledge that had been paid for with blood and courage. They were ready, not because they were fearless, but because they were taught that fear was a date, a point, not a master. They were prepared to face challenges she could not even imagine, and she found an immense comfort in that. The mantle was being passed, not in a single, dramatic gesture, but in the steady, continuous rhythm of teaching and learning, of one generation standing on the shoulders of the last. The Umbrals, as a concentrated force, were indeed diminished, their great design unraveled at the moment of its near triumph. Malachar was gone, his voice silenced, his influence severed. Yet their legacy was a permanent scar on the world's consciousness, a chilling reminder that the capacity for manipulation, for feeding on discord, was not an external monster that could be slain forever, but a perpetual whisper in the human heart. A bitter political rivalry that escalated too quickly, a rumor that spread with uncanny speed and venom, a community turning inward on itself based on ancient, half-remembered grievances. These were the echoes of the Umbral strategy, the patterns they had perfected. But that same legacy was also the source of the world's greatest strength. The memory of that close brush with eternal shadow was the very thing that fueled the Sentinel's vigilance and the public's willingness to question, to seek verification, to choose empathy over outrage. The shadows had taught the light how to shine more brightly. Watching the new Sentinels disperse to their duties, their faces alight with purpose, Alara understood the most profound truth of all. History was not shaped solely by the grand armies of the Maiar or the cosmic schemes of ancient entities. It was woven from a million tiny threads of choice and courage. A young scholar's decision to pursue a curious scroll, a historian's choice to overcome his fear, an archivist's vow to help, a soldier's sacrifice on a marble floor. These were the small actions that had cascaded into a world-altering wave. The world was safe, not because darkness had been abolished, but because an endless line of ordinary people had made the extraordinary choice to tend their own small lights, creating a constellation of awareness that could never be fully extinguished. And as long as that light was passed from one hand to the next, the future, whatever it brought, would be faced